Section 6. The extermination of the name of God. The anagram. The model of a symbolic exchange also exists within the field of language, something like the core of a political anti-economy. A site of the extermination of value and the law, poetic language. In the field of an anti-discourse, a beyond of the political economy of language, Saussures' anagrams constitute the fundamental discovery. The same discovery that will later lend its conceptual arms to linguistic science had previously, in his Cahiers d'anagrams, brought out the antagonistic character of a non-expressive language, beyond the laws, axioms, and finalities assigned it by linguistics, in the form of a symbolic operation of language, that is to say, not a structural operation of representation by signs, but exactly the opposite, the deconstruction of the sign and representation. The principle of poetic functioning proclaimed by Saussure does not claim to be revolutionary. Only the passion he puts into establishing this principle as the recognized and conscious structure of remote, Vedic, Germanic, and Saturnine texts, and establishing its proof, is proportionate to the incredible scope of his hypothesis. He himself draws no radical or critical consequences from it. He does not care for one moment to generalize it on a speculative level, and when he failed to find this proof, he abandoned this revolutionary intuition and went on to the edification of linguistic science. It is perhaps only today, at the term of half a century of uninterrupted development in this science, that we can draw out the consequences of the hypothesis Saussure abandoned, and investigate to what extent it lays the advance foundations for a decent ring of all linguistics. The rules of the poetic proclaimed by Saussure are the following. Point 2. The law of the coupling. 1. A vowel has no right to figure within the Saturnine unless it has its countervowel in some other place in the verse. 2. Ascertain the identical vowel, without attention to quantity. The result of this is that if the verse has an even number of syllables, the vowels couple up exactly, and must always have a remainder of 0, with an even total for each type of vowel. Page 195. Page 196. 2. The law of consonants is identical, and no less strict. There is always an even number of any consonant whatever. 3. He goes so far as to say that if there is an irreducible remainder either of vowels, unpaired verse, or consonants, then, contrary to what we might think, this does not escape condemnation even if it is a matter of a simple e. We will then see it reappear in the following verse, as a new remainder corresponding to the overspill from the preceding one. The law of the theme word. In the composition of the verse, the poet sets the phonemic material provided by the theme word to work. 1, or several, verse, s, contain, s, anagrams of a single word, in general a proper name, of a god or a hero, by being constrained to reproduce itself, especially in a vocal rendition. On hearing one or two Latin Saturnine verses, F. de Saussure heard the principal phonemes of a proper name become clearer and clearer. Stravinsky, Lemos, p. 28. Saussure writes, in the hypogram, it is a matter of emphasizing a name or a word, striving to repeat its syllables and thus giving it a second, artificial way of being, added, so to speak, to the original being of the word. Torasia Sasauna Samnio Sepit, Scipio. Asan Argalian Anemen Omega Rtos Otmi, Agamemnon. These simple rules are repeated untiringly in multiple variants. As regards alliteration, the rule to which it used to be thought we were able to submit all ancient poetry, Saussure says that it is only one aspect of an otherwise vast and important phenomenon, given that all syllables alliterate, or assonate, or are combined in some other phonemic harmony. Phonemic groups become echoes. Entire verses to be anagrams of other preceding verses, however far off, in the text. Polyphonies visually reproduce, when the occasion arises, the syllables of an important word or name, whether they figure in the text or present themselves naturally to the mind through the context. Pietri analyzes the phonemic substances of words, whether to turn them into acoustic series or signifying significative series when one alludes to a certain name, the anagrammatized word jb. In short, everything is answered, in one way or another, within the verse. Whether the signifiers or the phonemes answer one another throughout the verse, or the hidden signified, the theme word, is echoed from one polyphony to the other, beneath the manifest text. Moreover, both rules can coexist. Sometimes conjointly with antiphony, sometimes beyond every word we imitate, there is a correspondence of all the elements, translating into an exact coupling, that is to say, a repetition as a pair of even numbers. Saussure will hesitate between the terms of anagram, antigram, hypo. Page 196. Page 197. Gram, paragram, and paratext to designate the elaborate variation that allows the perspicacious reader to perceive the evident but dispersed presence of conducting phonemes. Stravinsky, Lemos, p. 33. We could, as an extension of Saussure's work, propose the term anathema, which is originally the equivalent of an ex voto, of a votive offering. The divine name running beneath the text, and to whom the text is consecrated, the name of he who consecrates and to whom it is consecrated. 3. These two laws appear to say extremely little as regards what we could say about the essence of the poetic. Furthermore, they take no account of the poetic effect, of the enjoyment jouissance proper to texts, or of their aesthetic value. Saussure has only considered the poet's inspiration, not the reader's ecstasy. Perhaps he would never even have claimed that there was any relation whatsoever between the rules he clarifies. He thought he observed them, and that's all there is to it, and the exceptional intensity it has always been agreed that we find in poetry. By limiting his perspective to a formal logic of the signifier, he seems to leave the concern with looking for poetic enjoyment of the wealth of the signified and the profundity of expression to others who, with one accord, have always done so, psychologists, linguists, and the poets themselves. Saussure, however, and Saussure alone, tells us that the enjoyment derived from the poetic is enjoyment in that it shatters the fundamental laws of the human word. Linguists become refugees in the face of this subversion of their discipline, in an untenable paradox. They acknowledge, with Roman Jacobson, that the poetic anagram cuts across the two laws of the human word as proclaimed by Saussure, that of the codified bond between the signifier and its signified, and that of the linearity of signifiers. The means employed by poetic language are such that they make us take leave of the linear order. F. de Saussure sur les Anagrams, in Selected Writings, Volume 7, Berlin, Mouton, 1985, p. 247. Or, as Stravinsky summarizes it, we leave the consecutive temporality proper to common language, Lemos, p. 47. And simultaneously affirm that Saussure's researches open up unprecedented perspectives in the linguistic study of poetry. Jacobson, Selected Writings, Volume 7, p. 246. An elegant manner to recuperate the poetic as a particular field of discourse, on which linguistics retains the monopoly. What does it matter if the poetic denies the laws of signification, since we will neutralize it by giving it the keys to the city of linguistics, and by requiring it to obey the same reality principle? But what is a signified or a signifier if it is no longer governed by the code of equivalence? What is a signifier if it is no longer governed by the law of linearity? And what is linguistics without all this? Nothing, but we will see the contortions it goes through in order to make amends for this violence. Linguistics gets out of Saussure's first law, the coupling, by putting forward the redundancy of the signifier, or indeed the frequency with which a particular phoneme or polyphony occurs, which is greater than the. Page 197. Page 198. average in ordinary language, etc., it gets out of the second, properly anagrammatic, law by invoking the latent name Agamemnon, as the secondary signified of a text that inevitably expresses or represents it, conjointly with the manifest signified. One and the same signifier splits into two signifieds, says Jacobson Selected Writings, Volume 7, p. 247, a desperate attempt to save, even if it was through a more complex operation, the law of linguistic value and the essential categories of the mode of signification, signifier, signified, expression, representation, equivalence. The linguistic imaginary seeks to annex the poetic to itself and even claims to enrich poetic's economy of the term and value. But against it, and giving full scope to Saussures' discovery, it must be said that, on the contrary, the poetic is a process of the extermination of value. The law of the poem is in fact to make sure, following a rigorous procedure, that nothing remains of it. This is why it contrasts sharply with the discourse of linguistics, which, for its part, is a process of the accumulation, production and distribution of language as value. The poetic is irreducible to the mode of signification, which is nothing other than the mode of production of the values of language. This is why it is irreducible to the linguistic, which is the science of this mode of production. The poetic is the insurrection of language against its own laws. Saussure himself never formulated this subversive consequence. Others, however, have accurately assessed the danger inherent in the simple formulation of another possible formulation of language. This is why they have all made to conceal this in accordance with their code, calculating the signifier as a term, and the signified as value. The poetic as the extermination of value. One Saussure's first law, that of the coupling, is in no way, as he himself insists, that of the unlimited expressive alliteration or redundancy of some phoneme or other. Por qui sunt ces serpents qui sifflent sur nos têtes? For whom are these snakes whistling over our heads? These serpents are the rattlesnakes of a linguistics of the recurrence and accumulation of the signified, SSSSCAID. Also whistles in the signifier, and the more SS there are, the more CA whistles, the more menacing it is and the better it expresses. Thus again, the faint fresh flame of the young year flushes from leaf to flower and flower to fruit. In Swinburne's lines, says Yvonne Fonaggi, we feel the breeze passing, without the poem expressly mentioning it, form and function in poetic language, Diogene, 51, 1965, p. 90. Saussure's coupling is a calculated, conscious, and rigorous duplication which refers to another status of repetition, not as the accumulation of terms, as the accumulative or. Page 198. Page 199. Alliterative, pulsion, but as the cyclical cancellation of terms, 2 by 2, the extermination of doubling by the cycle. Vowels always couple up exactly, and must always give a remainder of 0. Saussure cited in Starobinsky, Lemos, p. 21. And in the emblematic citation that he gives this law numero 10 pari gaudet, God rejoices in even numbers, it is said that in one way or another, enjoyment is inseparable not from amassing the same, reinforcing meaning by the addition of the same, but quite the contrary, from its cancellation by the double, by the cycle of the anti-vowel, or the antigram where the phonetic character comes to be cancelled as if in a mirror. 2. Saussure's second law, which concerns the theme word or the anathema that runs through the text, must be analyzed. In the same way, it must be seen that it is not at all a matter of repeating the original signifier or reproducing its phonematic components throughout a text. Ausen Argalian anemen omega rtos otmi does not reproduce Agamemnon even though Saussure is ambiguous on this point. He says, in the hypogram it is a question of emphasizing a name, a word, striving to repeat its syllables and thus giving it a second, artificial way of being added, so to speak, to the original being of the word. In fact, the theme word is diffracted throughout the text. In a way, it is analyzed by the verse or the poem, reduced to its simple elements, decomposed like the light spectrum, whose diffracted rays then sweep across the text. In other words, then, the original corpus is dispersed into partial objects. It is therefore a matter not of another manner of being the same, of reiteration or paraphrase, of a clandestine avatar of the original name of God, but rather of an explosion, a dispersion, a dismembering where this name is annihilated. Not an artificial double, what uses this unless it is in order to be reduced to the same thing, but a dismembered double, a body torn limb from limb like Osiris and Orpheus. Far from reinforcing the signifier in its being, repeating it positively, this metamorphosis of its scattered members is equivalent to its death as such, to its annihilation. To sum it up, this is, on the level of the signifier, of the name it incarnates, the equivalent of putting God or a hero to death in the sacrifice. Following this, the animal totem, the god or the hero circulate, disarticulated, disintegrated by its death in the sacrifice, eventually torn limb from limb and eaten, as the symbolic material of the group's integration. The name of God, torn limb from limb, dispersed into its phonemic elements as the signifier, is put to death, haunts the poem and rearticulates it in the rhythm of its fragments, without ever being reconstituted in it as such. The symbolic act never consists in the reconstitution of the name of God after a detour and analytic breakdown within the poem. The symbolic act never consists of the resurrection of the signifier. Stravinsky is wrong when he says, page 199. Page 200. It will be a matter of reassembling the principal syllables, as Isis reunited Orpheus' dismembered body. Lacan gets his theory of symbolism wrong when he says, if man finds himself open to desiring as many others within himself as his members have names other than his, if he is to recognize as many disjointed members, lost without ever having been a unity, as there are beings that are metaphors of these members, we can also see that the question of ascertaining the epistemological value of these symbols has been resolved, since these are the very members that return to him after wandering through the world in an alienated fashion. La Psychanalyse, Volume V, 1960, p. 15. The symbolic act is never in this return, in this retotalization that follows alienation, in this resurrection of an identity. On the contrary, it is always in the volatilization of the name, the signifier, in the extermination of the term, disappearance, with no return. This is what makes possible the intense circulation on the interior of the poem, also in the primitive group. On the occasion of feasting and sacrifice, this is what gives enjoyment a language, and, again, one from which nothing results nor remains. The entire pack of linguistic categories cannot do too much to efface the scandal of the loss and death of the sine fetter in this feverish agitation of language which, as Baudrillard says concerning life, demands that death exert its ravages at its expense. Here, of course, the limits Saussure imposes on himself explode. This poetic principle is not only applicable to Vedic, Germanic or Latin poetry, and it is pointless to seek, as he did, for a hypothetical generalization of the proof of this. It is obvious that modern poets have never made use of the generative theme word, if ever the ancient poets did. But this is not an objection, since it is clear that, for all languages in all epochs, the form Saussure distinguished is sovereign. It is clear to all enjoyment bears witness to this that a good poem is one where nothing is left over, where all the phonemic material in use is consumed, and that, on the other hand, a bad poem, or not poetry at all, is one where there is a remainder, where not every significant phoneme, diphoneme, syllable, or term has been seized by its double, where not every term has been volatilized and consumed in a rigorous Reciprocity, or antagonism, as in primitive gift exchange, where we feel the weight of the remainder that has not found its corresponding term, nor therefore its death end. Absolution, which has not been successfully exchanged in the very operation of the text, it is in proportion to this residue that we know that a poem is bad, that it is the slag of discourse, something which has not exploded, which has been neither lost nor consumed in the festival of reversible speech. Value is residue. It is the discourse of signification, our language governed by linguistics. The economy of signification and communication, where we produce and exchange terms and meaning values, under the law of the code, rests on everything that has not been seized by the symbolic operation of language, by symbolic extermination. The economic process is inaugurated in the same way. What re-enters the page 200. Page 201. Circuits of accumulation and value is what remains from sacrificial consumption, what has not been exhausted in the incessant cycle of the gift and the counter-gift. It is this remainder that we accumulate, we speculate on the rest, and here the birth of the economic begins. We can distinguish a third dimension of our mode of signification from the notion of the remainder. We know that the poetic operation shatters the fundamental laws of language. 1. The signifier signified equivalence. 2. The linearity of the signifier, Saussure. In linguistics, we should not, due to its being obvious, lightly disregard the truth that the elements of a word follow each other, since, on the contrary, it provides in advance the central principle of all useful reflection on words. 3. The third dimension, never really taken into account, and strictly interdependent with the two others, is that of the boundlessness, the limitless production of signifying material. Just as equivalence defines a dimension of the economic, that of unlimited productivity, the infinite reproduction of value, so the signifier signified equivalence defines an unlimited field of discursivity. We no longer even see this proliferation of our discursive customs, it becomes so natural to us, but it is what distinguishes us from all other cultures. We use and abuse words, phonemes, and signifiers with no ritual, religious or poetic restriction of any kind, in total freedom, with no responsibility as regards the immense material that we produce. As we please. Everyone is free to endlessly use and endlessly draw on phonemic material in the name of what they want to express and with the sole consideration of what they have to say. This freedom of discourse, the possibility of taking it and using it without ever returning it, answering to it, nor sacrificing even a share of one's goods to it, as the primitives used to in order to ensure its symbolic reproduction, the idea of language as an all-purpose medium of an inexhaustible nature, like a place where the utopia of political economy would be realized, to each according to his needs, this phantasm of an unprecedented stock, a raw material that would be magically reproduced in exact proportion to its use, no need even for primitive accumulation, and therefore the freedom of a fantastic wastage, is the exact status of our discursive communication, a staggering availability of signifying material. All this is thinkable only in a general configuration where the same principles govern the reproduction of both material goods and the species itself. A mutation runs simultaneously through social formations where material goods, the number of individuals and the proliferation of words are, in a more or less rigorous fashion, distributed, limited and controlled inside a symbolic cycle. And our modern social formations, which are distinguished by an infinite productivity, as economic as it is linguistic and demographic. These societies are caught in an endless escalation at every level, material accumulation, linguistic expression, and the proliferation of the species. 4. Page 201. Page 202. This model of productivity, exponential growth, galloping demographics, unlimited discursivity, must be simultaneously analyzed everywhere. On the plane of language, which is alone in question here, it is clear that the unrestrained freedom to use phonemes in unlimited number for purposes of expression, without the reverse processes of cancellation, expiation, reabsorption or destruction, it does not matter which term, is radically opposed by the simple law announced by Saussure, that in poetry a vowel, a consonant, or a syllable cannot be uttered without being doubled, that is to say, somehow exorcised, without fulfilling itself in the repetition that cancels it. From that point on, there is no question of unlimited use. The poetic, like symbolic exchange, brings into play a strictly limited and distributed corpus, but it undertakes to reach the end of it, whereas our economy of discourse implements an unlimited corpus that cares nothing for resolution. What becomes of words and phonemes in our discursive system? We should not think that they graciously disappear as soon as they have served their purpose, nor that they return somewhere, like the characters on a linotype matrix, and wait until the next time they are used. Again, this is part of our idealist conception of language. Every term or phoneme, not taken back, not returned, not volatilized by poetic doubling, not exterminated as a term and as a value, in its equivalence to what it meant or wanted to say, remains. It is a residue. It will return to a fantastic sedimentation of waste, of opaque discursive material. We begin to perceive that the essential problem of a productive civilization may be that of its waste, which is nothing other than the problem of its own death, giving way under its own remains. Industrial leftovers are nothing, however, in relation to the remains of language. Such as it is, our culture is haunted and jammed by this gigantic, petrified, residual instance. By means of an escalation of language it attempts to reduce a tendential decline in the rate of communication. Nothing happens. Just as every commodity, that is to say, everything produced under the sign of the law of value and equivalence, is an irreducible residue that comes to bar social relations, so every word, every term, and every phoneme produced and not symbolically destroyed accumulates like the repressed, weighs down on us with all the abstraction of dead language. An economy of profusion and wastage rules over our language, the affluent utopia. But although affluence and wastage are recent characteristics of the material economy, an historical trait, they appear to be a natural dimension, always already given, of spoken or written language. There is and will always be, at every instant, a utopia, insofar as we will want it for the whole world, the utopia of an unlimited capital of language as use and exchange value. In order to signify, everyone proceeds by the accumulation and cumulative exchange of signifiers whose truth lies elsewhere, in the equivalence to what they want to say. One can say it in fewer words. Concision is a moral virtue, but this is only ever an economy. Page 202. Page 203. Of means. This discursive consumption, over which the spectre of penury never hangs, this wasteful manipulation, sustained by the imaginary of profusion, results in a prodigious inflation that leaves, in the image of our societies of uncontrolled growth, an equally prodigious residue, a non-degradable waste of consummated, but never entirely consumed, signifiers. For used words are not volatilized, they accumulate like waste, assign pollution as fantastic as, and contemporary with, industrial pollution. Linguistics seized the stage of the waste product déchet, the stage of a functional language that it universalizes as the natural state of all language. It imagines no other. Just as the Romans and the Etruscans divided the sky by rigid mathematical lines, and in this way delimited space as a templum and conjured up a god, so every people has above them such a sky divided up by mathematical concepts and, under the demand for truth, it intends that from now on every conceptual god should be sought nowhere other than within this sphere. Nietzsche, The Philosopher's Book. This is what linguistics does, it forces language into an autonomous sphere in its own image, and feigns to have found it there objectively, when, from start to finish, it invented and rationalized it. It is incapable of imagining a state of language other than that of the combinatory abstraction of the code long accompanied with an infinite manipulation of speech parole, in other words, speculation, in the double sense of the term, on the basis of general equivalence and free circulation, everyone using words as they please and exchanging them in accordance with the law of the code. But let's suppose a stage where the signs of language were deliberately distributed, like money is for the RR. Restricted distribution, no formal freedom of production, circulation, or use. Or rather a double circuit. The circuit of liberated words, gratuitously usable, circulating as exchange value, a zone of meaning commerce. Analogous to the sphere of the Gimwali in economic exchange. The controlled circuit of a non-liberated zone, of a material restricted to symbolic use where words have neither use nor exchange value, and where they cannot be gratuitously multiplied nor uttered, analogous to the sphere of the Kula for precious goods. The general principle of equivalence does not operate in this sphere, nor therefore does the logical and rational articulation of the sign with which semiolinguistic science is preoccupied. The poetic recreates the situation of primitive societies in linguistic material, a restricted corpus of objects whose uninterrupted circulation in the gift exchange creates an inexhaustible wealth, a feast of exchange. Assessed by their volume or their value, primitive goods end up in an almost absolute penury. Tirelessly consumed in feasting and exchange, they recount, through their minimal volume and number, the maximal. Page 203. Page 204. Energy of signs of which Nietzsche spoke, or the first and only genuine affluent society of which Marshall Solons spoke. Les Temps Modernes, October 1968. Words here have the same status as objects or goods, they are not freely available to everybody, language has no affluence. In these magical and ritual formulations there reigns a restriction which alone preserves the symbolic efficacy of signs. The shaman and the prophet, Vates, act on considered, coded and limited phonemes or formulae, exhausting them in a maximal configuration of meaning. So the formula is pronounced, in its literal and rhythmic exactitude, so it binds the future, but not because it signifies. 5. The same goes for the poetic, which is defined by the fact of operating on a restricted corpus of the signifier, and by aiming to resolve it completely. And it is precisely because the poetic, or the primitive ritual of language, aims not at the production of signifieds, but at the exact consumption and cyclical resolution of a signifying material, that it takes on a limited corpus. Limitation is neither restrictive nor penurious in this context, it is the fundamental rule of the symbolic. Conversely, the inexhaustible character of our discourse is bound to the rule of equivalence and linearity, just as the infinite character of our material production is inseparable from the change to equivalence in exchange value. It is this linear infinity which simultaneously breeds, at every moment of capital, the fact of poverty and the phantasm of a final wealth. The signifier, doubling up and returning to cancel itself out, follows the same movement as the gift and the counter-gift. Giving and returning, it is a reciprocity where the use value and the exchange value of an object cancel each other out. And the same complete cycle results in the nothingness of value, on which the intensity of the social relation or the enjoyment of the poem acts. This is a question of revolution. What the poetic accomplishes with the phoneme value at a microscopic level, every social revolution accomplishes over the entire flanks of the code of value, use value, exchange value, rules of equivalence, axioms, value systems, coded discourses, rational finalities, etc. when the death drive is linked to it in order to volatilize them. This same process of completion does not stop short of the analytic operation, in contrast to science as A process of accumulation, the real analytic operation eliminates its object, which comes to an end in it. The term of the analysis, not its constructive finality, but its real end, is this volatilization of the object and its own concepts, or again. These are the processes of the subject who, far from attempting to master its object, accepts being analyzed by it in turn. In which movement the respective positions of each are irremediably dismantled. It is only from this point that the subject and the object are exchanged, whereas in their respective positivity, in science for example, they merely draw themselves erect and face each other off for an indefinite period. Science is bound to the construction of its object and to its repetition as a phantasm, as much as to page 204. Page 205. The phantasmatic reproduction of the subject of knowledge. A perverse pleasure is attached to this phantasm, the pleasure of continually reconstructing a faltering object, whereas it is proper to analysis, and to enjoyment, to bring its object to an end. 6. The poetic is the restitution of symbolic exchange in the very heart of words. Where words, in the discourse of signification, finalized by meaning, do not respond to each other, do not speak to each other, and neither, within words themselves, do consonants, vowels and syllables, in the poetic, on the contrary, once the authority of meaning has been broken, all the constitutive elements enter into exchange with, and start to respond to, each other. They are not liberated. Nor is any deep or unconscious content set free through them, they are simply returned to exchange, and this very process is enjoyment. It is futile to look for the secret in an energetics, a libidinal economy or a fluid dynamics. Enjoyment is not bound up with the effectuation of a force, but with the actualization of an exchange in exchange. Without traces, where no force casts a shadow, since every force, and the law behind it, has been resolved. For it is the operation of the symbolic to be its own definitive end. The mere possibility of this is a revolution in relation to an order where nothing and no one, neither words, men, their bodies nor their gazes, are given access to direct communication, but instead pass in transit as values through the models that engender or reproduce them in total estrangement to each other. The revolution is everywhere where an exchange crops up, be it the infinitesimal exchange of phonemes or syllables in a poetic text, or of millions of men speaking to each other in an insurgent city that shatters the finality of the models, the mediation of the code and the consecutive cycle of value. For the secret of a social parole, of a revolution, is also the anagrammatic dispersal of the instance of power, the rigorous volatilization of every transcendent social instance. The fragmented body of power is then exchanged as social parole in the poetry of rebellion. Nothing remains of this parole, nor is any of it accumulated anywhere. Power is reborn from what is not consumed in it, for power is the residue of parole. In social rebellion the same anagrammatical dispersal is at work as that of the body in eroticism, as that of knowledge and its object in the analytic operation. The revolution is symbolic or it is not a revolution at all. The end of the anathema. The whole science of linguistics can be analyzed as resistance to the operation of dissemination and literal resolution. Everywhere there is the same attempt to reduce the poetic to a meaning, a wanting to say vouloir dire, to bring it back under the shadow of a meaning, to shatter the utopia of language and to bring it back to the topic of discourse. Linguistics opposes the discursive order, equivalence and accumulation, to the literal order, reversibility and dissemination. We can see this counter-offensive unfolding in the interpretations of the poetic given here and there. Page 205. Page 206. Jacobson, Fonaggi, Umberto Eco. See the linguistic imaginary, below. Psychoanalytic interpretation, to which we will return, also arises from this resistance. For the radically of the symbolic is such that all the sciences or disciplines that labor to neutralize it come to be analyzed by it in their turn, and return to their ignorance mechanisance. These, then, are the principles of linguistics and psychoanalysis that will be at stake as regards Saussures' anagrammatic hypothesis. Although he made this hypothesis in connection with a precise point and subject to assessment, there is nothing to prevent us developing it and drawing out its ultimate consequences. In any case, the radicalization of hypotheses is the only possible method, theoretical violence being the equivalent, in the analytic order, of the poetic violence which replaces the order of all the atoms of a phrase of which Nietzsche speaks. We will begin with Stravinsky's commentary on Saussure les mots, pages 33 ff. Two aspects of his commentary are especially in question here, the theme word, whether or not it exists, and the specificity of the poetic, and thus Saussure's discovery. Saussure's whole argument seems to draw its support from the real existence of the keyword, the latent signifier, the matrix and the corpus princeps. This versification seems to be dominated by a phonemic preoccupation, sometimes internal and free, the mutual correspondence of elements by couplets or rhymes, sometimes external, that is to say, drawing inspiration for phonemic composition from a name like Scipio, Jove, etc. And we know that after having had this intuition, all his efforts were brought to bear on establishing its proof. Here, it is true, Saussure falls into the trap of scientific validation, into the superstition of the fact. Fortunately, he fails to establish this proof, of knowing whether the practices of the ancient poets were governed scientifically by the anagram of the theme word, and this failure preserves the scope of his hypothesis, which would in fact, once delimited by a proof, be restricted to a certain type of ancient poetry and, more seriously, it would have restrained the poetic act to the formal gymnastics of the cryptogram, a game of hide-and-seek with the keyword, playing for the reconstitution of a term that had been voluntarily buried and dislocated. This is how Stravinsky interprets it. Poetic discourse will therefore only ever be the second manner of being of a name, an elaborate variation that would allow the perspicacious reader to see the obvious but dispersed presence of the principal phonemes. The hypogram slides from a simple name into the complex spread of the syllables in a line. It will be a question of recognizing and reassembling of the principal syllables, as Isis reunites the dismembered body of Osiris. From the outset, Stravinsky eliminates both the emanationist or mystical theory, the germinal diffusion of the theme word through the line, and the productive theory, the theme word used by the poet as a framework for the labor of composition. The theme word is neither an original cell, nor page 206. Page 207. A model. Saussure never tries to establish a relation of semantic privilege between the two levels, nominal and anagrammatiste, of the word. Mannequin, sketch, miniature scene, theme, or anathema, what status can we give it? This is important, since the whole schema of signification, of making a sign, is at stake. It is certain at least that we cannot turn the theme word into the signified of the poem as signifier, and no less certain that there exists, if not a reference, then at least a coherence between the two. Stravinsky seems to be sticking as close as possible to Saussure when he proposes the latent theme word differs only from the manifest line by its compression. It is a word like the many words deployed in the line. They differ only therefore in the way that the one differs from the multiple developed before. The total text, hidden behind the text, or rather in it, the theme word shows no qualitative difference. It is neither of a superior essence, nor of a more humble nature. It offers its substance to an inventive interpretation, causing it to survive in an extended echo. But, if it is a word like other words, why is it necessary that it is hidden or latent? On the other hand, the manifest text is something other than the development, multiplication, prolongation, and echo of the theme word, in itself, the echo is not poetic. This something else is dissemination, dismemberment, and deconstruction. Stravinsky overlooks this aspect of the operation until his most nuanced interpretation. The diction of the theme word seemed to be dislocated, subjected to a rhythm other than that of the vocables, through which the manifest discourse unfolds. The theme word becomes looser, in the manner in which the subject of a fugue is stated, when it is treated as imitation by augmentation. There can be no question of recognizing it, the theme word never having been the object of an exposition. It must be divined in a reading, attentive to the possible links between disparate phonemes. This reading is developed according to another tempo, and in another tense. Ultimately, we leave the time of the continuity proper to customary language. This interpretation, more subtle in that it is allied to the analytic process, floating attention to a free discourse, also seems however to fall into the trap of presupposing a generative formula, whose scattered presence in the poem would in some sense be merely a secondary state, whose identity it would nevertheless always be possible, it is even the necessary condition of reading, to locate simultaneous double presence at two levels. Osiris dismembered is the same in another form. His finality is to become Osiris again following the phase of dispersion. The identity remains latent, and the process of reading is a process of identification. This is the trap, this is the linguistic defense. As complex as they are, these interpretations only ever turn the poetic into a supplementary operation, a detour in a process of recognition, of a word, a term, a subject. It is always the same that is given to read. But then why this laborious reduction, and what makes all this poetic? If it is in order to repeat the same term, if the line is only the phonemic dissimulation of the page 207, page 208 keyword, then all this is futile complication and subtlety, and enjoyment remains unexplained. Poetic intensity never consists in the repetition of an identity, but in the destruction of an identity. It is ignorance mechaniscence of this that produces the linguistic reduction. This is where it subtly distorts the poetic in the direction of its own axioms, identity, equivalence, refraction of the same, imitation by augmentation, etc. It especially never recognizes the mad distortion, the perdition of the signifier and death in the anagram, as the symbolic form of language, remaining within the linguistic game, where poetry is only a code, a key, in the way we speak of a key to dreams. This is what society's games do, and this is all they do. This is what bad poetry, allegory, and figurative music do, when they refer in too facile a fashion to what they signify, or endlessly metaphorize into other terms. These are charades, riddles and spoonerisms, in which, with the discovery of the keyword, everything is complete. And of course there is pleasure in this detour, as there is removing the mask from what is hidden, and whose secret presence attracts you. But this pleasure has nothing to do with poetic enjoyment, which is radical in another way, and not perverse. Nothing is discovered in it, nothing expressed in it, and nothing shows through it. No riddles or divinations, no secret terms, no abutment of meaning. The poetic destroys every cleared path towards a final term, every key, it resolves the anathema, the law weighing down upon language. We could offer the hypothesis that enjoyment is a direct function of the resolution of every positive reference. It is at its minimum where the signified is immediately produced as value, in normal communicative discourse linear and steady speech, exhausted in decoding. Beyond this discourse the zero degree of enjoyment all sorts of combinations are possible where a game of hide and seek is set up with the signified, a deciphering, and no longer a pure and simple decoding. This latter is the traditional anagram or the text with keys, the Yamamoto Kakboat or the texts from the Fliegende interpreted by Freud and analyzed by Lyotard in The Dream Work Does Not Think, Oxford Literary Review, 6, 1, 1983, where, behind a coherent or incoherent manifest text, there lies a latent text to be found. In both cases, there is a disengagement, a distantiation of the signified, of the last word of history, a detour by way of the signifier, difference as Derrida says. But in any case, it is possible, by whatever developments, to seize hold of the last word, the formula that controls the text. This formula may be subconscious, in the joke, the mot d'esprit, to which we shall return, or unconscious, in the dream, but it is always coherent and discursive. With the dawning of this formula, the cycle of meaning is exhausted. And enjoyment, in every case, is proportionate to the detour, the delay, the loss of the statement, to the time lost in rediscovering it. It is therefore extremely restrained in society's games, more intense in the mot d'esprit, where the decoding is suspended and where we laugh in proportion to the destruction of meaning. In the poetic text, it is infinite, because no code whatsoever can be found there, no. Page 208. Page 209. Deciphering is possible, and because there is never a signified to put an end to the cycle. Here, the formula is not even unconscious. This is the limit of all psychoanalytic interpretations, it does not exist. The key is definitively lost. This is the difference between simple cryptogrammatic pleasure, the entire category of the brainwave, where the operation always ends up with a positive residue, and the symbolic radiation of the poem. In other words, if the poem refers to something, it is always to nothing, to the term of nothingness, to the signified zero. Poetic intensity consists in the vertigo of this perfect resolution, which leaves the place of the signified or the referent perfectly empty. 7. Abali bibelo diananite sonor, a perfect line where the anagrammatic form is taken up again. Abali is the generative theme word running throughout the line, and referring to nothing. The anagrammatic form and its content seal an extraordinary union here. Several other things can be advanced concerning the theme word, even within the limits of Saussures' hypothesis. The hypogram, being a god's or a hero's name, is not just any signified, and not even a signified at all. We know that the literal invocation of God is dangerous because of the forces it unleashes. For this reason, the anagram is necessary to veil the incantation by rigorously, but obliquely, spelling out the name of God. This elusive mode differs radically from the mode of signification, for the signifier stands for the absence, dispersal, and putting to death of the signified. The name of God appeared in the eclipse of its own destruction, in the sacrificial mode, exterminated in the literal sense of the term. From this point, it is clear that the make or break question Saussure puts to himself, and on which Starobinsky's objection entirely rests, concerning the positive existence of the theme word, is beside the point, since the name of God exists only in order to be annihilated. We endlessly create the identity of the name of God, with which no kind of enjoyment is associated, since enjoyment proceeds from the death of God and His name, and more generally from the fact that where something used to be a name, a signifier, an agency, nothing remains. In this there is an agonizing overhaul of our anthropological conceptions. It is said that poetry was always the exaltation, the positive celebration of a god or a hero, or a great many other things. But we must see, on the contrary, that it is only beautiful and intense because it returns the god to death, because poetry is the site of its volatilization and his sacrifice, because in it all the cruelty, in Artaud's sense, and ambivalence of the relation to the gods is played out in a precise manner. You must be as naive as a Westerner to think that the savages prostrated themselves before their gods as we do before ours. On the contrary, in their rites they have always been able to actualize their ambivalence towards the gods, perhaps they only ever roused them in order to put them to death. This is still alive in the poetic. In the poetic, God is not invoked in any other form, the poem does not keep trotting out his name in extension. Once again, what interest would there be in this? A prayer wheel is quite enough to repeat his name. He is. Page 209. Page 210. Resolved, dismembered, and sacrificed in his name. We could say, following Baudrillard, that the discontinuity, discursivity of the name is abolished in the radical continuity of the poem. The ecstasy of death. In the poem, God is not even the hidden subject of the utterance, nor is the poet the subject of enunciation. Language itself adopts speech so as to disappear in it. And the name of God is equally the name of the Father, the law, of repression, of the signifier, of castration, that it brings to bear on the subject and, at the same time, language is exterminated in the anagram. The poetic text is the example, realized at last, of reabsorption without residue, without trace, without the merest atom of a signifier, the name of God, and, through this, of the agency of language itself and, through this reabsorption, the resolution of the law. The poem is the fatal declension of the name of God. For us, who no longer have a God, but for whom language has become God, the full and phallic value of the name of God is diffused for us throughout the extent of discourse. The poetic is the site of our ambivalence as regards language, of our death drive as regards language, of the force proper to the extermination of the code. The 9 billion names of God. In a science fiction story, Arthur C. Clarke, The 9 Billion Names of God in Of Time and Stars, Harmon's Worth. Penguin, 1981, pages 1532, a brotherhood of lamas, lost in the foothills of Tibet, devote their whole lives to the recitation of the names of God. There are a great many of these names, 9 billion. When they have all been stated and declined, the world will come to an end, an entire cycle of the world. Bringing the world to an end, step by step, word by word, by exhausting the total corpus of the signifiers of God, this is their religious delirium or the truth of their death drive. But the lamas read slowly, their difficult task lasting many centuries. They then hear talk of mysterious Western machines that can record and decode at an incredible speed. One of them sets about ordering a powerful computer from IBM to hasten their task. The American technicians arrive in the Tibetan mountains to set up and program the machine. According to them, it will take only 3 months to get to the last of the 9 billion names. 8. They themselves do not believe a word of the prophesied consequences of this enumeration, and, shortly before the expiry of the operation, afraid that the monks might turn against them when faced with the failure of their prophecy, they flee the monastery. Then, climbing down into the civilized world, they see the stars go out one by one. The poem, too, is the total resolution of the world, as soon as the scattered phonemes of the name of God are consumed in it. When the anagram has been completely declined, nothing remains, the world has turned once again, and the intense enjoyment running through it has nowhere else to come from. Page 210. Page 211. The second point on which Starobinsky's commentary bears is the specificity of the poetic. Basically, he says, the rules Saussure evokes and imputes to a deliberate and calculated act may be reduced to the basic givens of all language. On the first rule, of the coupling, the total phonemic opportunities language offers at every instant to whoever wants to make use of them are sufficiently numerous not to demand a laborious combination, requiring instead an attentive combination. Ultimately, no more chance, pure probability is sufficient. Again, the facts of phonemic symmetry. The term symmetry is already a reductive term, that sees a specular redundancy in the doubling of phonemes. JB noted here are striking, but are they the effect of an observed rule, of which no testimony has survived? Could we not invoke, to justify the multiplicity of internal correspondences, an only barely conscious and half-instinctive taste for the echo? An instinctive taste for the echo, the poet would be basically nothing other than a linguistic particle accelerator who merely increases the rate of the redundancy of customary language. That's what inspiration is, and there is no need to calculate for it, a little attention and instinct is all we need. Must the ancients' poetic practices resemble the obsessional ritual more than the search of inspired speech? Of course we can acknowledge formal constraints. It is true that traditional scansion subjects the Vates diction to a regularity that we must indeed qualify as obsessional. Nothing prevents us from imagining, since the facts go along with this, an increasing formal requirement that would oblige the poet to use every phonetic element twice in the same line. But whether the poet is an inspired resonator or a calculating obsessional, it is always the same type of interpretation. The coupling and the anagram are the effects of a resonance, a redundancy, an imitation by augmentation, etc. In short, the poetic is a play of combinations, and since all language is combinatory, the poetic becomes once more a particular case of language. Why do we not turn our attention to an aspect of the process of speech in the anagram, a process which is neither fortuitous, nor fully conscious? Why should there not exist an iteration, a generative and involuntary repetition, that would double and project the materials of a primary speech within discourse, unpronounced and at the same time non-evanescent? Due to the lack of a conscious rule, the anagram can nevertheless be considered as a regularity, or a law, where the arbitrary theme word submits to the necessity of a process. The hypothesis of the theme word, and its rigorous dispersal, uncovers the extremely simple truth that language is an unending resource, and that dissimulated behind every phrase is the increasing clamor of the multitude from which it was taken in order to be isolated in front of us in its originality. But what then did Saussure uncover? Nothing. Was this a staggering? Page 211. Page 212. Error? Worse, a platitude, generalized in this way, his hypothesis is annihilated. This is how, in all linguistic good faith, the radical difference of the poetic is denied. Saussure was at least seized by the intoxication of the poetic, the intoxication of the rigor with which he saw language turn back on itself, operating on its own material, instead of unfolding in a linear manner, idiotically following on from itself, as in customary discourse. This is no longer the case. With Stravinsky, rigor has become an obsession, a psychopathological category, total dispersion has become a probabilistic occurrence/recurrence, anagrammatic dispersion has become the clamoring multitude of language, a harmonic contextuality where a particular meaning is specified in turn. Every discourse is a set that facilitates the subtraction of a subset. Moreover, every text is itself the subset of another text. Every text incorporates and is incorporated. Every text is a productive product. Onwards to the Russian dolls, to the abyssal and abime textuality dear to Telkal. Stravinsky's whole argument amounts to saying either the poet is just an obsessive formalist, if we follow Saussure's hypothesis, or his operation is exactly the same as that of all language, and so it is Saussure who is the obsessive. Everything he believed he had discovered is nothing but the researcher's retrospective illusion, since every complex structure provides the observer with sufficient elements for him to select a subset apparently endowed with meaning, which nothing prevents us according in a priori logical or chronological antecedence. Poor Saussure, who saw the anagram everywhere, and attributed his phantoms to the poets. Stravinsky and the linguists do not dream. By verifying Saussure's hypothesis ad infinitum, they reduce it to zero. To do this it was enough to stick to its content, the inference of the theme word, its positive role, its metamorphoses, instead of judging it on its form. The stakes of the poetic are not the production of, nor even the combinatory variations on, a theme, nor an identifiable subset. In this case, in fact, it is clearly part of a universal mode of discourse, except we cannot then see the necessity of the poetic, its different status, nor the enjoyment proper to this mode as opposed to that of discourse. Its stake is, precisely through the labor of the anagram, the point of no return in whatever term or theme. At this point, whether the theme word's existence is recognized or not is a false problem. This is not because, according to Starobinsky, every language is, at bottom, articulated on a sort of code or formula, but because, in any case, it is the annihilation of this code that is the form of the poetic. As Saussure describes it, this form holds for all poetry, the most modern and the most ancient. The principle of the annihilation of the code retains all its intelligibility even if the existence of this formula cannot be verified. 9. The only thing is that this code, which in ancient poetry could have taken the form of a word theme, might, in modern poetry, be no more than. Page 212. Page 213. Signifying constellation that can no longer be located as such, even a letter or a formula of the Clarion type, lost forever, or unconscious, or even the differential signifier that Telkel talks about. What is essential, whatever the formula is to consider the poetic not as the mode of the formula's appearance, but as its mode of disappearance. In this sense, so much the better that Saussure failed to find proof of the formula. By verifying the content, he would have taken away the radically of the form. Saussure's failure and intoxication, since they at least maintain the urgency of the poetic, are better than all the banalities that accept the poetic as a fact of universal language. The linguistic imaginary. We must now leave Saussure and look at how the linguists dealt with the poetic and the questions it brought to bear on their science. All things considered, the defense they put up in the face of this danger is the same as that mounted by the adherents of political economy, and its Marxist critics, in the face of the symbolic alternative in previous societies and in our own. All of them chose to differentiate and modulate their categories while not changing their principle of rationality in any way, that is, without changing the arbitrariness and the imaginary that made them hypostatus the order of discourse and the order of production as universals. As scientists, they have good reason to believe in this order, since they are agents of order. Thus the linguists concede that the arbitrary character of the sign is a bit shaken by the poetic, but certainly not the signifier/signified distinction, nor therefore the law of equivalence and the function of representation. Indeed, in a certain way, the signifier in this instance represents the signified far better, since it expresses it directly following a necessary correlation between each element of the substance of the signifier and what it is supposed to express, instead of referring to it arbitrarily, as in discourse. The signifier's autonomy is conceded. The conceptual messages transmitted through the intermediary of sound necessarily differ from the preconceptual contents in the sound sequences and rhythms themselves. They either happen to converge or diverge. I. Phonagy, Diogene, 51. However, this is basically so that the signifier better embodies, not merely by convention, but in its materiality and its flesh, what it has to say. In Swinburne's lines, we feel the breeze passing. Instead of it being, as in conceptual language, the unit of primary articulation, the phoneme, the unit of secondary articulation becomes representative, while, however, the form of the representation has not itself changed. It is always a question of referring, no longer to the concept by means of the terms of the langue nor syntax, but by means of vowels and syllables, the atoms of language, and their combination in rhythm, to an elementary presence, to an original instance of things, the breeze as primary process. Between. Page 213. Page 214. The substance of language and the substance of the world, wind, water, feelings, passions, the unconscious, everything. Preconceptual, which is in fact already conceptualized, without appearing to be, by a whole code of perception, there is always a positive correlation at play, a play of equivalence amongst values. In this way, muted vowels would stand for the dark and obscure, etc., and there would no longer be an arbitrary conceptual equivalence in this case, but a necessary phonemic equivalence. Thus Rimbaud's vowel sonnet, and Fonagy's entire exposition of the symbolism of linguistic sounds, Diogene, 51, p. 78. Everyone would agree to recognize that I is lighter, faster and thinner than U, that K and R are harder than L, etc. The feeling of thinness associated with the vowel I may be the result of a subconscious kinesthetic perception of the position of the tongue in the emission of this sound. The R appears masculine, by reason of the greater muscular effort required to emit it in comparison with the alveolar L or the labial M. A real metaphysics of an original langue, a desperate attempt to rediscover a natural deposit of the poetic, an expressive genius of language, that would only have to be captured and transcribed. In fact, all this is coded, and it is just as arbitrary to correlate the repetition of the phoneme F with the passing breeze as it is to correlate the word table with the concept of table. There is nothing more in common between them than there is between a piece of music and what it evokes, landscape or passion, other than cultural convention, or a code. That this code claims to be anthropological, naturally soft vowels, takes nothing away from its arbitrary character. Conversely, moreover, we can clearly maintain, with Benvenisti, that the very strong cultural convention that binds the word table to the concept of table imposes genuine necessity, and that at bottom the sign is never arbitrary. This is correct. The fundamental arbitrariness lies not in the internal organization of the sign, but in the imposition of the sign as value, that is to say, in the presupposition of two instances and their equivalence in accordance with the law, the sign acting as a stand-in, as emanating from a reality that makes signs to you. Such is linguistics metaphysics, and such is its imaginary. Its interpretation of the poetic is still haunted by this presupposition. By contrast, when Harpo Marx waves a real sturgeon instead of pronouncing the password sturgeon, then indeed, by substituting the referent of the term and by abolishing their separation, he really explodes the arbitrariness at the same time as the system of representation, in a poetic act par excellence, putting the signifier sturgeon to death by its own referent. Whether conceptual or preconceptual, it is always the message and the aim of the message as such, by which Jacobson defines the poetic function, which by autonomizing the operation of the signifying material merely refers it to a supplementary effect of signification. Something other. Page 214. Page 215. Then the concept comes through, but it is still something, another value is realized through the very play of the signifier. But it remains a value, the signifying material functions at another level, its own, but it continues to function, moreover. Jacobson makes the poetic function supplementary rather than alternative, just one linguistic function out of many, a surplus value of signification due to which the signifier itself is taken into account as an autonomous value. The poetic gives you more. The self-presence presence all we mim of the signifier is analyzed in terms of redundancy, as an internal echo, as resonance, phonetic recurrence, etc. Hopkins, the verse is a discourse that repeats, either wholly or partially, the same phonemic figure. Or again, it is acknowledged that poets worthy of the name possess a delicate and penetrating sensibility as regards the impressive value of the words and sounds with which they compose, to communicate this value to their readers. They are often moved to represent, around the principal word, the phonemes that characterize it, in such a way that, in short, this word becomes the generator of the entire line in which it appears. M. Grammont, Trait de Phonetic Paris, Delagrave, 1933. In all this, the labor of the signifier always appears as a positive assemblage, concurrent with that of the signified, which sometimes coincide, and sometimes diverge, to cite phonology again, but in any case the outcome is merely a subjacent current of signification, no question of escaping the being of discourse. And it could not be otherwise from a perspective that conceives the poetic as the autonomization of one of the functional categories of the order of discourse. The other Jacobsonian formula maintains this illusion: the poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection to the axis of combination. Equivalence is promoted to the rank of the constitutive process of the sequence. In poetry, one syllable is equalized with any other syllable of the same sequence. Word stress is assumed to equal word stress, as unstress equals unstress, long is matched with long, short is matched with short. Jacobson. Linguistics and Poetics in Language and Literature, ed. K. Pomorska and S. Rudy, Cambridge, Mass., Harvard. 1987, p. 71. Of course, articulation is no longer that of customary syntax, it is always rather a question of a constructive architecture. That anything other than a scansion of equivalence could start to play a role in prosody is never envisaged. Jacobson is content to substitute the ambiguity of the signified for the ambivalence of the signifier. Ambiguity is what characterizes the poetic and distinguishes it from the discursive. Ambiguity is an intrinsic, inalienable character of any self-focused message. Briefly, a corollary feature of poetry. Jacobson, Linguistics and Poetics, p. 85. The machinations of ambiguity are among the very roots of poetry. Empson, 7 Types of Ambiguity, London, Chatto and Windus, 1963. Jacobson again. Page 215. Page 216. The supremacy of the poetic function over the referential function does not obliterate the reference but makes it ambiguous. The double-sensed message finds correspondence in a split addresser, a split addressee, as well as in a split reference. Linguistics and Poetics, p. 85. In this way, all the categories of discursive communication work loose in the poetic, all, curiously, except the code, of which Jacobson does not speak. What does the code become? Does it too become ambiguous? But it would then be the end of Long and linguistics. Ambiguity is not dangerous in itself. It does not change the principles of identity and equivalence in the slightest, nor does it change the principle of meaning as value, it merely produces floating values, renders identities diffuse, and makes the rules of the referential game more complex, without abolishing anything. Thus, for Jacobson, the ambiguous sender and addressee merely signifies the uncoupling of the I/U relation, internal to the message, from the author/reader relation. The positions of the respective subjects have not been lost. In some sense they expand indefinitely. Subjects become unsettled in their subject positions. Thus the message becomes unsettled. Ambiguous, in its definition, all categories, sender, addressee, message, referent, move, work loose in their respective positions, but the structural grid of discourse remains the same. The machinations of ambiguity do not therefore make a great deal of difference to the form of discourse. Jacobson has this bold formula: poetry does not consist in adding rhetorical ornament to discourse, it involves a total revaluation of discourse and all its components, whatever they may be. Bold and ambiguous, since the components, sender/addressee, message/code, etc., maintain their separate existences. They are simply revalued. The general economy remains the same, the political economy of discourse. At no point does this thought advance to the point of the abolition of separate functions, the abolition of the subject of communication, and therefore the sender/addressee distinction, the abolition of the message as such, and therefore of all the codes. Structural autonomy. All this work, in which the radical character of the poetic act consists, is swamped by ambiguity, and by a certain hesitation as regards linguistic categories. A discourse within a discourse, a message centered on itself. All this merely defines a rhetoric of ambiguity. But the ambiguous discourse, squinting at itself, a strabismus of signs, remains the discourse of positivity, the discourse of the sign as value. In the poetic, by contrast, language turns back on itself to be abolished. It is not centered on itself, it decenters itself. It undoes the entire process of the constructive logic of the sign, resolving all the internal specularity that makes a sign a sign, something full, reflected, centered on itself, and, as such, effectively ambiguous. The poetic is the loss of the spectacular closure of the sign and the message. At bottom, this is the same metaphysics that has governed the theory of artistic form since Romanticism, the bourgeois metaphysics of totality. Art. Page 216. Page 217. Should properly evoke this quality of being a whole and of belonging to the larger, all-inclusive, whole which is the universe in which we live. John Dewey, Art as Experience, pages 1945, quoted in Umberto Eco, The Open Work Tr. Anna Cancani, London, Hutchinson Radius, 1989, p. 26. Eco appropriates this cosmology for himself, and retranscribes it in linguistic terms. The totalization of meaning takes place by means of a chain reaction and the infinite subdivision of signifieds. All this is attained by means of an identification between signifier and signified. The aesthetic sign is not confined to a given denotatum, but rather expands every time the structure within which it is inevitably embodied is duly appreciated. A sign whose signified, resounding relentlessly against its signifier, keeps acquiring new echoes. Ibid, p. 36. This, then, is a schema of a first, denotative, phase of reference, followed by a second phase of harmonic reference, where a theoretically unlimited chain reaction is operative, hence the evocation of the cosmic. This theory serves as the basic ideology of everything we have been able to say about the poetic, nor does psychoanalysis escape this. Ambiguity, polysemia, polyvalence, polyphony of meaning, it is always a matter of the radiation of the signified, of a simultaneity of significations. The linear character of discourse hides an harmonious concert of different messages. Phonagy, Diogene, 51, p. 104. The semantic density of language, the wealth of information, etc., the poet liberates all sorts of virtualities, with, as a corollary, a differential hermeneutics of the role played by the reader. Every interpretation enriches the text with that reader's personal harmonies. This whole myth plays on a savage preconceptual anteriority and a virginity of meaning. The poet rejects the usual and appropriate term for the concept, which is a skeletal reduction of all previous experiences, when he finds himself in front of an untamed, virginal, reality. The word must be recreated each time from an intense personal experience. The skeleton of the thing in itself must be attired in living flesh so as to give it the concrete reality the thing has for me. Ibid, p. 97. We are no longer sure whether to undress the concept or dress it up in order to rediscover the virginity of the poetic. In any case, it is a question of uncovering the secret correspondences that might exist between things. This romantic theory, with its conception of genius, paradoxically turns out to be rewritten today in terms of information theory. This polyphonic wealth can be put in terms of additional information. At the level of the signified, Petrarch's poetry constitutes a large capital of information on love, echo, the open work, p. 54. At the level of the signifier a certain type of disorder, rupture, and negation of the customary and predictable linguistic order increases the rate of information of the message. There would be a dialectical tension between the elements of order and disorder that can serve as a base rate within the poetic. Whereas the most probable use of the linguistic system would yield nothing, the unexpectedness of the page 217. Page 218. Poetic, its relative improbability, determines a minimum rate of information. Here again, the poetic gives you more. Thus the semiological imaginary easily reconciles romantic polyphony and quantitative description. The structure of poetry can most rigorously be described and interpreted in terms of a chain of possibilities. A superior accumulation at mid-range frequencies of a certain class of phonemes, or the contrasting assemblage of two opposed classes in the phonemic texture of a line, a strophe, or a poem, plays the role of a subjacent current of signification. Phonology, Diogene, 51. In language, form has a manifestly granular structure, which is open to a quantitative description, Jacobson. With this, we can confront Kristeva. Words are not non-decomposable entities held together by their meaning, but assemblages of signifying phonemic and scriptural atoms leaping from word to word, thus creating unsuspected and unconscious relations between the elements of the discourse. This putting into relation of signifying elements constitutes a signifying infrastructure of the langue. Julia Kristeva, Poésie et Négativite, in Semidiotique Paris, Seuil, 1969, p. 185. All these formulas converge on the idea of a Brownian stage of language, an emulsional stage of the signifier, homologous to the molecular stage of physical matter, that liberates harmonies of meaning just as fission or fusion liberate new molecular affinities. The whole conceived as an infrastructure, a subjacent current, that is to say, as a logically prior, or structurally more elementary, stage of discourse, just like matter. This is a scientistic, materialist view of discourse, where the atom and the molecule are properly assimilated to the secondary articulation of language, as the molecular stage and original stage, prior to the differentiating organization of meaning is to the poetic. Besides, Kristeva is not afraid of her own metaphor. She says that modern science has broken the body down into simple elements in the same way as poetic linguistics has disarticulated signification into signifying atoms. There, concurrently with the metaphysics of primary articulation, the metaphysics of signifieds, bound to the play of signifying units, what we might call the metaphysics of secondary articulation takes shape, in which the effect of infrastructural signification is bound up with the play of distinct units, the minimal entities of discourse, where they are once again taken as positive valencies, just as atoms and molecules have an elementary valency, as phonemic materiality whose assemblage takes place in terms of linkages and probabilities. But the poetic is no more based on the autonomous articulation of the phonemic levy than on that of words or syntax. It does not play secondary articulation off against the primary. 10. It is the abolition of the analytic distinction of the articulations on which language's capacity for discourse and its operational autonomy rests, as the means of expression, and as the object of linguistics. In any case, why should the phonemic level be more materialist than that of the lexical concept or the sentence? As soon as we page 218. Page 219. Turn the phonemic into minimal substances, the phoneme, like the atom, becomes an idealist reference. With the physics of the atom, science relentlessly entrenches its positivist rationality. It has not brought the phonemic any closer to another mode, which would presuppose the respective extermination of the object and subject of science. Perhaps today it is reaching its borders, at the same time as materialism is in total theoretical crisis, without meanwhile being able to step beyond its shadow. There is no dialectical transition between science, even at the apogee of its crisis, and something perhaps beyond it and irremediably separated from it, since science is founded on the basis of the denegation, not dialectical negation, but denegation, of dialectics. The most rigorous materialism will never lead beyond the principle of the rationality of value. Telkel have taken the deconstruction of the sign furthest, up to the total liberation of the signifier. End of the mortgage of the signified and the message. There is no polysemia, it is the signifier that is plural. No more ambiguity of the message, just the intertextuality of the signifier, which is linked with and is produced by its pure material logic. The endless text of the paragram, significance is the real level of the productivity of language, a productivity beyond value, opposed to the signification of the sign product. Julia Kristeva, in Poesy et Negativite, pages 185 ff, comes closest to acknowledging a poetic form, even if the superstition of a materialist production of meaning leads her nevertheless, by returning the poetic to the semiotic order, to censoriously describe it as a radical alternative. She posits the ambivalence of the poetic signified, and not its mere ambiguity. It is concrete and general at the same time. It includes both logical affirmation and negation. It announces the simultaneity of the possible and the impossible. Far from postulating the concrete versus the general, it explodes this conceptual break. Bivalent logic, 0/1, is abolished by ambivalent logic. Hence the very particular negativity of the poetic. The bivalent logic of discourse rests on the negation internal to the judgment. It founds the concept and its self-equivalence. The signified is what it is. The negativity of the poetic is a radical negativity bearing on the logic of judgment itself. Something is and is not what it is. A utopia, in the literal sense, of the signified. The thing's self-equivalence, and, of course, the subject's, is volatilized. Thus the poetic signified is the space where non-being intertwines with being in a thoroughly disconcerting manner. But there is a danger, which can be seen in outline in Kristeva's work, of taking this space as a topic again, and taking the intertwining as, once again, the dialectic. There is a danger of filling this space up with every figure of substitution. Metaphor, metonymy, and all the tropes are inscribed in space surrounded by this double semantic structure. The danger of the metaphor, of an economy of metaphor that remains positive. In Kristeva's chosen example, Baudelaire's meubles. Voluptueux, voluptuous furniture, the poetic effect does not stem from an added erotic value, a play of additional phantasms, nor from a metaphorical or metonymic value. It. Page 219. Page 220. Stems from the short circuit of the two, the furniture being no longer furniture and the voluptuous pleasure no longer being voluptuous pleasure. The furniture, meubles, becomes voluptuous, and the voluptuous pleasure becomes mobile. Nothing remains of the two separated fields of value. Neither of the two terms is poetic in itself, no more than their synthesis is. They are poetic in that the one is volatilized in the other. There is no relation between poetic enjoyment and the voluptuous pleasure as such. In love, there is only voluptuous pleasure, but it becomes enjoyment when it is volatilized into furniture. And the furniture is cancelled by the voluptuous pleasure in the same way. The same reversal sweeps away the proper position of each term. It is in this sense that Rimbaud's formula stands. It is true literally, in every sense. Metaphor is simply the transfer of value from one field to the other, to the point of the absorption of a multiplicity of texts, meanings, in the message. Kristeva, Poesy et negativite, p. 194. The poetic implies the reversibility of one field onto the other, and thus the annulment of their respective values. Whereas values are combined, implicated, and intertextualist. In the metaphor according to a play of harmonies, the secret accord of language, in poetic enjoyment they are annulled, radical ambivalence is nonvalence. Kristeva, then, reduces the radical theory of ambivalence to a theory of intertextuality and the plurality of codes. The poetic can no longer be distinguished from discourse save by the infinite nature of its code, it is a plural discourse, the other only being the limit case of a monological discourse, a discourse with only one code. There is therefore a place for both types of discourse in a general semiotics. The semiotic practice of speech discourse is only one possible semiotic practice, Ibid, p. 215. Semanalysis has a duty to take them all into account, without exclusion, that is to say, without neglecting the irreducibility of the poetic, but equally without reducing it to the logic of the sign. Semanalysis has a duty to constitute a non-reductive typology of the plurality of semiotic practices. There is an increasing intricacy of the different logics of meaning. The functioning of speech law parole is impregnated with paragrammatism, just as the functioning of poetic language is circumscribed by the laws of speech. Ibid, p. 214. Once again Starobinsky's doubts about Saussure come to the surface, the latter's tolerance of both the poetic and the discursive in the name of universal rules of language, here in the name of a genuinely materialist science called semiotics. In fact, this is a reductive and repressive position. For from the poetic to the discursive there is no difference. In their respective articulation of meaning, there is a radical antagonism. Neither of them is an infrastructure of signification, would the logical discourse on it be its superstructure. Further, discourse, logos, is not a particular case. In the infinity of codes, it is the code that puts an end to infinity, it is the discourse of closure that puts an end to the poetic, to the para and the. Page 220. Page 221. Anagrammatic. Conversely, it is on the basis of its dismantling, its destruction, that language revives the possibility of infinity. In fact, infinity of codes is a bad term, since it permits the amalgam of the one and the infinite in the mathematics of the text, and their distribution along a single chain. It must be said, in terms of radical incompatibility and antagonism, that it is on the basis of the destruction of the discourse of value that language revives the possibility of ambivalence. This is the poetic revolution in relation to discourse, where the one can only be the death of the other. The semiotic project is only a more subtle way of neutralizing the radically of the poetic and saving the hegemony of linguistics, rebaptized semiotics, no longer by pure and simple annexation, but under of the ideology of plurality. The subversion of linguistics by the poetic does not stop here, it leads one to wonder whether the rules of language even hold good for the field of language over which they prevail, that is to say, in the dominant sphere of communication. Similarly, the failure of political economy to give an account of anterior societies leads one, as an after effect, to wonder if these principles have any value for us. Now it is true that the immediate practice of language is somewhat resistant to the rational abstraction of linguistics. O'Manani puts this well in the ellipsis and the bar. Linguistics originates from the bar it has installed between the signifier and the signified, and their reunion spells its death, which brings us back to conversation in everyday life. L'ellipse et la bar, in clefs pour l'imaginaire. p. 35. The Saussurian bar has facilitated the renewal of linguistic theory from top to bottom. In the same way, Marxism, by means of the concept of a material infrastructure opposed to the superstructure, has established something like an objective and revolutionary analysis of society. Science is based on rupture. In exactly the same way, a science, a rationalist practice, organization, originates from the distinction between theory and practice. Every science and every rationality lasts as long as this rupture lasts. Dialectics makes endless formal adjustments to this rupture, it never resolves it. To dialecticize the infra and the superstructure, theory and practice, or even signifier and signified, langue and parole, is merely a vain effort at totalization. Science lives and dies with the rupture. This is indeed why current non-scientific practice, both linguistic and social, is revolutionary in some way, because it does not make these kinds of distinctions. Just as it has never made a distinction between mind and body, whereas every dominant religion and philosophy survives only on the basis of this distinction, so are everybody's immediate end. Savage social practices do not make a distinction between theory and practice, infra and superstructure, of itself end. Without debating the issue, it is transversal, beyond rationality, whether bourgeois or Marxist. Theory, good Marxist. Theory, never analyses real social practice, it analyzes the object that it produces for itself through separating this practice into an infra and a. Page 221. Page 222. Superstructure, or, in other words, it analyzes the social field that it produces for itself through the dissociation between theory and practice. Theory will never lead back to practice since it only exists through having vivisected it, fortunately. This practice is beginning to return to and even overcome it. But this brings with it the end of dialectical and historical materialism. In the same way, the immediate, everyday linguistic practice of speech and the speaking subject pays no attention to the distinction between the sign and the world, nor that between signifier and signified, the arbitrary character of the sign, etc. Benvenisti says and acknowledges this, but only as regards memory, since this is precisely the stage that science overcomes it and leaves it far behind. It interests only the linguistic subject, the subject of the langue, which is at the same time the subject of knowledge, Benvenisti himself. Somewhere, however, the other is right, speaking in advance. Endeca of the distinction between sign and world, in total superstition the other, along with ourselves and even Benvenisti, knows more, it is true, about the essentials than Benvenisti the linguist. For the methodology of the separation of signifier and signified holds no better than the methodology of the separation of the mind and the body. They same imaginary in both cases. In the one case, psychoanalysis 11 came to say what this was, as, in the other, did poetics. But there has basically never been any need for psychoanalysis nor for poetics, no one has ever believed in them apart from the scholars and linguists themselves, just as, in the final analysis, no one has ever believed in economic determinism other than economic scientists and their Marxist critics. Virtually, and literally, speaking, there has never been a linguistic subject, it is not even true of we who speak that we purely and simply reflect the code of linguistics. Likewise, there has never been an economic subject, a homo economicus. This fiction has never been inscribed anywhere other than in a code. There has never been a subject of consciousness, and there has never been a subject of the unconscious. In the simplest practice, there is always something that cuts across these simulation models, which are all rational models. There has always been a radically absent from every code, every objective rationalization, that has basically only ever given rise to a single great subject, the subject of knowledge, whose form is shattered from today, from now, by undivided speech. Point 12. Basically we have all known this for much longer than Descartes, Saussure, Marx, and Freud. The wits, or the phantasm of the economic in Freud. Is there an affinity between the poetic and the psychoanalytic? If it is clear that poetic form, dissemination, reversibility, Strict delimitation of the corpus cannot be reconciled with linguistic form, the signifier-signified equivalence, linearity of the signifier, undefined corpus. It seems, on the contrary, that it intersects with psychoanalytic form, primary processes. Page 222. Page 223. Displacement, condensation, etc. In the dream, the lapsus, the symptom, and the joke, or mot d'esprit, everywhere the unconscious works, we can, with Freud, read the distortions of the signifier-signified relation, the linearity of the signifier, the discrete sign. This distortion of discourse, excess, and transgression of language, where the phantasm operates, marks enjoyment. But what of desire and the unconscious in the poetic, and up to what point does libidinal economy account for it? The poetic and the psychoanalytic do not mix. The symbolic mode is not that of the labor of the unconscious. To question the poetic as Freud does is therefore to question psychoanalysis from the standpoint of the symbolic. The analysis in reverse is always the only one that, by means of this very reversal, allows us to escape theory, which is purely and simply the exercise of power. Freud's analysis of the joke, the mot d'esprit, can serve as our guiding thread, for otherwise there is no theorized difference in Freud between the properly symptomatic field and that of the work of art and artistic creation. The concept of sublimation, as we know, suffers from a lack of rigor and an hereditary idealism. This is a point of considerable importance. If the poem is neither a lapsus nor a mot d'esprit, there is nothing to account for it in the theory of the unconscious. Contrary to Saussure, who is not concerned with poetic pleasure nor even with any cause or finality whatever of what he describes, Freud's analysis is functional. It is a theory of enjoyment jouissance in which work on the signifier is always related to the fulfillment of a desire. Moreover, this is an economic theory of enjoyment. The wits, the mot d'esprit or joke moves more rapidly, by way of shortcuts and short circuits, towards what it means to say, and it says things, it liberates significations that would never have existed without it, other than at the cost of considerable conscious intellectual effort. It is this ellipsis of psychical distance that is the source of enjoyment. In other words, the joke lifts the censorship, and the subversion this bring about liberates the energies bound to the superego and the process of repression. The liberation of affects, the disinvestment of unconscious or preconscious representations, the disinvestment of the repressing psychical agency. In any case, enjoyment emerges from a residue, an excess or a differential quantum of energy made available by the operation of the wits. In this sense, concision, or the multiple use of the same material in different modalities, is a fundamental characteristic of the mot d'esprit. Always economizing on effort, a single signifier may signify at multiple levels. We draw a maximum of sometimes contradictory significations from a minimum of signifiers. It is futile to insist on analogies with the poetic mode. The multiple use of the same material evokes Saussure's anagram, coupling the necessary delimitation of the corpus and the maximal energy in signs of which Nietzsche speaks. Freud too says of the poet that polyphonic orchestration allows him to emit messages on the threefold levels of clear consciousness, the subconscious, and the uncon. Page 223. Page 224. Science. In every instance so much energy is economized in relation to the ordinary system of distributing investments. In the polygon of forces that is the psychical apparatus, enjoyment is like the result of a sort of shortcut, or rather of the transversality of the wits, which, cutting a diagonal across the diverse layers of the psychical apparatus, catches up with its objective with less expenditure, even effortlessly attaining unforeseen objectives, yielding a kind of energetic surplus value, the enjoyment premium, the yield of pleasure. This energetic calculus has something of the whiff of capital about it, the capital of a saving of energy. Freud continually employs this term, where enjoyment never comes about save by the subtraction, by default, of a residue or a surplus from an investment, but never an excess, or even from nothing at all, from an inverse process of expenditure, the abolition of energies and finalities. We are not speaking primarily about labor, or even the signifier, because this level is never primary for Freud. His libidinal economy is based on the existence of unconscious contents, effects and representations, of a repression and a production of the repressed, a calculated investment that steers this production towards an equilibrium, the resolution of tension, of bound and unbound energies. Freudian enjoyment takes place and is spoken of in terms of forces and quanta of energy. In the wits or the dream, the play of signifiers is never in itself the articulation of enjoyment, it only opens roads to phantasmatic or repressed contents. The unconscious is a medium, which is never a message in itself, since something like desire strictly understood in terms of the topological or the economic theory is necessary in order that it, the idea that speaks in its own voice. The play of the signifier is only ever the tracery of desire. Here, around the unconscious mode of production, and its mode of representation, is where the entire problem of libidinal economy and the critique of libidinal economy is posed, in the perspective of an enjoyment that never had anything to do with the economic. In the psychopathology of everyday life, Freud says of the slip of the tongue, the lapsus. The reader's preparedness alters the text and reads into it something which he is expecting or with which he is occupied. The only contribution towards a misreading which the text itself need make is that of affording some resemblance in the verbal image, which the reader can alter in the sense he requires. Standard Edition, Volume 6. 1960, pages 11213. It is of course a matter of a latent, repressed content, waiting to leap up and profit from the fantasies, the interstices and the weak points of logical discourse in order to cause an explosion. This, at the level of discourse, is what happens to the body in the concept of anaklesis. Desire profits from the satisfaction of a physiological need in order to invest libidinally in a particular zone of the body, diverting the pure and simple function, organic logic, towards the fulfillment of desire. While this is true, it is not entirely true, since the articulation of the need and the desire has never been clarified. Between the two terms, so thoughtlessly formulated, on the page 224. Page 225. One hand is the determinate completion of a function, and on the other as the indeterminate fulfillment of a desire. The concept of anaklesis is only a bridging concept that articulates nothing at all. Here libidinal economy suffers from the same layering of the concept of need as does the economy in general. Between the subject and the object, there is need. Between the need and the desire, there is anaklesis, the same as in linguistic economy, between the signifier and the signified, or between the sign and the world, there is, or is not, a motivation. All these layerings have the discrete charm of an insoluble science. If the articulation is impossible, it is because the terms have been badly formulated, because their very position is untenable. Somewhere, doubtless, the autonomization of desire in the face of need, of the signifier in the face of the signified, and of the subject in the face of the object, is only an effect of science. But the economies that follow from all this have a hard time, since they do not want to renounce the regular oppositions by which they live. Desirinade, unconscious conscious, primary secondary process, and so on. Is the pleasure principle itself anything other than the psychoanalytic reality principle? It is certain, however, that psychoanalysis has given the signifier-signified relation an almost poetic slant. The signifier Instead of manifesting the signified in its presence, is in an inverse relation with it, it signifies the signified in its absence. And its repression, in accordance with a negativity that never used to appear in linguistic economy. The signifier is in a necessary, not an arbitrary, relation with the signified, but only as the presence of something is with its absence. It signifies the lost object and takes the place of this loss. The concept of representation could hardly, in psychoanalysis, be situated between an objective reality on the one hand and its signifying figuration on the other, but rather between an hallucinated reality, anemic image of a lost object of satisfaction, on the one hand, and a substitute object on the other, whether it is a formula object like that constituted by the phantasm, or an instrumental contraption such as the fetish may be. S. Leclerc. Psychanalyzer Paris, Seuil, 1968, p. 65. Linguistic equivalence is lost, since the signifier is instead of and in the place of something else which no longer is, nor has it ever been. It is always therefore what it no longer is. The fetish object, in its vacillating identity, is the endless metaphoric series of what is permanently denied, the absence of the phallus in the mother, sexual difference. The removal of identifying marks from psychoanalytic signification in relation to linguistics is well formulated by Manani. By introducing the signifier, we make meaning lose its balance. This is not because the signifier brings with it a collection of signifieds of the sort that a semantics of the traditional type might locate them, but because we interpret Saussures' ellipsis as if it kept the place of the signified empty, a place which can only become full again in the different discourses in which a single signifier is then the common element. If we also uncouple the signifier from the weight, page 225, page 226, of the signified, it is not in order to give it over to the laws which linguistics discovers in every manifest discourse, but in order that it may be said to obey the law of the primary process, by means of which it escapes, if only for a hesitant moment, the apparent constraints of a discourse that always tends towards the univocal, even though it exploits the equivocal. L. ellipse et la bar, p. 46. A remarkable passage. But what is this blank signified that successive discourses will fill? What is a signifier liberated so as to be given over to another order? Can we take this play from the linguistic categories of the signifier and the signified without shattering the bar which separates them? The bar is the strategic element which establishes both the principle of non-contradiction in the sign, and its components as values. This is a coherent structure, so we cannot inject just anything into it, such as ambivalence, contradiction, or the primary process. Benveniste puts things clearly into focus in his critique of Freud's Gegensinder Urwort, on the antithetical meaning of primal words, 1910, Standard Edition, Volume 11, 1957, pages 155 ff. It is thus improbable a priori that languages, however archaic they are assumed to be, escape the principle of contradiction. Let us suppose that a language exists in which large and small are expressed identically, then the distinction between large and small literally has no meaning. For it is indeed contradictoriness to impute to a language both a knowledge of two notions as opposite while, at the same time, the expression of these notions as identical. E. Benveniste, Problems in General Linguistics Tr. Mary Elizabeth Meek, Miami, University of Miami Press, 1971, p. 71. And this is correct, ambivalence is never part of linguistic signification. It being proper to language to express only what it is possible to express, it is as absurd to imagine a meaning that would not be conveyed by some distinction, as it is on the other hand, to imagine a signifier that would mean everything. To imagine a state of language in which a certain object would be denominated as being itself and, at the same time, something else, and in which the relation expressed would be a relation of permanent contradiction, in which everything would be itself and something else, and hence neither self nor the other, is to imagine a pure chimera. Ibid, pages 712. Benveniste knows what he is talking about, since all linguistic rationalization is there in order to prevent precisely this. There is no risk of the ambivalence of the repressed rising to the surface of linguistic science, since the latter is in its entirety a part of the repressing agency. But within its own order, linguistic science is right, nothing will ever participate in language that does not obey the principles of non-contradiction, identity and equivalence. It is not a matter of saving linguistics, it is a matter of seeing that Benveniste is clear-sighted concerning the choice to be made here. Moreover, he is only clear-sighted here because it is a matter of protecting his field from incursions from other fields. He tolerates the existence of a symbolic area somewhere else, but this area is discourse, not language. Page 226. Page 227. Stay at home and language will be well protected. We cannot be content to interpret the Saussurian ellipsis and bar in order to return the sign to the primary process, to bring it under analysis. The entire architecture of the sign must be demolished, even its equation must be broken, and it is not enough merely to multiply the unknown factors. Alternatively, then, we must assume that psychoanalysis still makes room somewhere for a certain mode of signification and representation, a certain mode of value and expression. This is in fact precisely what Manini's empty signified stands for. The place of the signified remains marked as that of the mobile contents of the unconscious. If therefore we are, with the psychoanalytic signifier, beyond all logical equivalence, we are not, for all that, outside nor beyond value. For in its hesitation trebuchet, it always designates what it represents as value in absentia, under the sign of repression. Value is no longer logically conveyed by the signifier, it haunts it phantasmatically. The bar separating them has changed its meaning, but it remains nevertheless. There indeed remains a potential signified, a repressed signifier with an unresolved value content, on the one hand, and a signifier, itself an instance established as such by repression, on the other. In fact, there is no longer any equivalence, but equally, there is no more ambivalence, that is, dissolution of value. Here lies the difference with the poetic, where the loss of value is radical. There is no more value in the poetic, not even absent or repressed, to nourish a residual signifier in the form of a symptom, a phantasm, or a fetish. The fetish object is not poetic, precisely because it is opaque, more saturated with value than any other, because the signifier is not disintegrated in it but, on the contrary, is fixed, crystallized by a value that is forever buried and forever hallucinated as a lost reality. There is no longer a means of unblocking the system, forever caught fast in the obsession with meaning, in the fulfillment of a perverse desire that comes to fill the empty form of the object with meaning. In the poetic, the symbolic, the signifier disintegrates absolutely, whereas in psychoanalysis it endlessly shifts under the effect of the primary processes, and is distorted following the folds of repressed values. Whether distorted, transversal or in points de capitan, as Lacan says, the psychoanalytic signifier remains a surface indexed on the turbulent reality of the unconscious, whereas in the poetic it diffracts and radiates in the anagrammatic process. It no longer falls under the blows of the law that erects it, nor under the blows of the repressed which binds it. It no longer has anything to designate, not even the ambivalence of a repressed signified. It is nothing more than the dissemination and the absolution of value, experienced, however, without the shadow of anxiety, in total enjoyment. The illumination of the work of art or the symbolic act comes from the point of the non-repressed, the point of no return, where the repression and the incessant repetition of meaning in the phantasm, or the fetish, the incessant repetition of the prohibition and value, are lifted, where death and the dissolution of meaning play without hindrance. Page 227. Page 228. Grasp in what has been written a symptom of what has been silenced, Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil Trrj. Hollingdale, Harmonsworth, Penguin, 1990. A psychoanalytic proposition par excellence, everything that means something, particularly scientific discourse in its transparency, has the function of silencing. And what it silences comes back to haunt it in an easygoing but irreversible subversion of its discourse. This is the place of the psychoanalytic, in the non-place relative to every logical discourse. The poetic, however, silences nothing, and does not come back to haunt it. For it is always death that is repressed and silenced. It is actualized here in the sacrifice of meaning. The nothing, death, absence, is overtly stated and resolved. Death is manifest at last, and is at last symbolized, whereas it is only symptomatic in all other formations of discourse. This, of course, signals the decline of all linguistics, which thrives on the bar of equivalence between what is said and what is meant, but it is also the end of psychoanalysis which, for its part, lives off the bar of repression between what is said and what is silenced, repressed, denied, phantasmatic and infinitely repeated in the mode of denial or denegation. Death. When, in a social formation or a formation of discourse, death speaks, is spoken and exchanged in a symbolic apparatus, psychoanalysis no longer has anything more to say. When Rimbaud says, of his saison and enfer, it is true. Literally, and in every sense, this also means that there is no hidden, latent, meaning, that nothing is repressed, that there is nothing behind it, that there is nothing for psychoanalysis. It is at this price that every meaning is possible. Linguistics originates from the bar it has installed between the signifier and the signified, and their reunion spells its death. Manani, L. et la bar, p. 35. Psychoanalysis too, originates from the bar it has installed, under the law of castration and repression, between what is said and what is silenced, or between an hallucinated reality and a substitute object. Leclerc, Psychanalyzer, p. 65. And for it, too, their reunion spells death. That there is no residue signifies that there is no longer a signifier and a signified, no signified behind the signifier, no structural bar distributing them on either side. It also signifies that there is no longer a repressed agency beneath a repressing agency, as there is in psychoanalysis, no longer a latent beneath a manifest, nor the primary processes playing hide and seek with the secondary processes. There is no signified, of whatever sort, produced by the poem, no more there is a dream thought behind the poetic text, nor a signifying formula, Leclerc, nor any kind of libido or potential energy, which somehow threads its way through the primary processes and would still testify to a productive economy of the unconscious. There is no more a libidinal than there is a political economy, nor of course than there is a linguistic economy, that is to say, a political economy of language. Because the economic, wherever it is based on the remainder, only the remainder permits production and reproduction. 13. Page 228. Page 229. Whether this remainder is that which is symbolically non-distributed and which re-enters commercial exchange and the circuit of commodity equivalence, whether this remainder is what is not exhausted in the anagrammatic circulation of the poem and enters the circuit of signification, or whether this remainder is quite simply the phantasm, that is to say, that which could not be resolved in the ambivalent exchange and death, and which, for this reason, is resolved as the precipitate of unconscious individual value, the repressed stock of scenes or representations which is produced and reproduced in accordance with the incessant compulsion to repeat. Market value, signified value, and unconscious/repressed value are all produced from what remains, from the residual precipitate of the symbolic operation. It is always this remainder that is accumulated and that fuels the diverse economies that govern our lives. To pass beyond economics, and if to change life has any meaning, it can only be this, is to exterminate this remainder in all domains. The poetic is the model of this, since it operates without equivalence, accumulation, or residue. To come back to the wits, can we not assume that enjoyment is the effect of economizing, of gaining potential due to the ellipsis of psychical distance, or the eruption of the primary process into the order of discourse, the eruption of a meaning beneath a meaning, or the deeper reality imposed by the presumed duality of the psychical agencies? Can we not assume that the finality of the other scene to come is produced by twisting this latter around, the finality of the return of the repressed as the psychical value of the very separation of the agencies, topographical hypothesis, and the corollary of a binding and an unbinding of energies from which, at a given moment, there would result the libidinal surplus value called enjoyment, economic hypothesis? Can we not assume that enjoyment happens on the contrary at the end of the separation of the separate fields, that it arises out of the very discrimination of the agencies, and therefore from the differential play of investments, and therefore from within the logical order of psychoanalysis? Is this the effect of the conflagration, the short circuit, Kirschschluss, telescoping between separate fields, phonemes, words, roles, institutions, that until then had meaning only due to their separation, and that lose their meaning in this brutal reconciliation that causes them to be exchanged? Is this not the wits, the effect of enjoyment where the separated subject is also lost, not only in the reflexive distance of consciousness, but also as regards the agency of the unconscious? The abolition of the superego at this moment, of the effort to maintain the discipline of the reality principle and the rationality of meaning, does not merely signify the effacement of the repressing agency to the advantage of the repressed agency, it signifies the simultaneous effacement of both. This is where we find something of the poetic in the wits and the comical, something beyond the compulsive resurrection of the phantasm and the fulfillment of desire. Freud cites Kant saying Das Komisch ist in nichts zergangen. Page 229. Page 230. Erwartung, the comic is a tense expectation that suddenly vanished, transformed into nothing. 14. In other words, where there used to be something, now there is nothing, not even the unconscious. Where there used to be some kind of finality, albeit unconscious, or even a value, albeit repressed, now there is nothing. Enjoyment is the hemorrhage of value, the disintegration of the code, the repressive logos. In the comic, the moral imperative of institutional codes, situations, roles, social characters, is lifted. In the wits, the moral imperative of the identity principle of words themselves, and even the subject, is eliminated for nothing, and certainly not in order to express the unconscious. Lichtenberg's definition of the knife, or the non-knife, an inspired and radically poetic witticism, retraces this explosion of meaning with no ulterior motive. A knife exists insofar as a blade and a handle exist and can be named separately. If the separation between the two is removed, and the blade and handle can only be reunited in their disappearance, as in Lichtenberg's joke, then, strictly speaking, there is no longer anything but enjoyment. The expectation of the knife, Kant said, the practical expectation, as well as the phantasmatic expectation, we know what the knife can mean to say. Vouloir dire, is resolved into nothing. And this is not a primary process, displacement, condensation, there is no eruption of something from behind the blade and the handle, there is nothing behind this nothing. End of separation, end of the unconscious. Total resolution, total enjoyment. The example of Lichtenberg is not an exceptional case. If we take a good look at them, all the examples of absurd logic, which is the limit of the wits, and the point at which enjoyment is at its most acute, chosen by Freud: the cauldron, the cake, the salmon mayonnaise, cats that have 2 holes cut in their skin precisely at the place where their eyes are, the child that, as soon as it comes into the world, is fortunate to find a mother to take care of it. All these examples can be analyzed in the same way, as the reduplication of an identity or a rationality that turns back on itself in order to disintegrate and be eliminated, as the reabsorption of a signifier into itself without a trace of meaning. Eifersucht ist eine Leidenschaft, die mit Eifersucht, was Leidenschaft, an untranslatable wits, jealousy is a passion that with eagerness seeks what causes pain. Multiple use of the same material, thus pleasure from the deduction of energy. But Freud himself admits that the multiple use of the same material is also the most difficult to accomplish, the simplest still being saying 2 different things with the aid of different signifiers. What changes is that the 2 things are said simultaneously. But the essential thing then is the abolition of the time the signifier takes to unfold, its successivity. Pleasure derives not from the addition of signifieds under the same signifier, economistic interpretation, but from the elimination of the logical time of enunciation, which amounts to the cancellation of the signifier itself, anti-economistic interpretation. Moreover, the Eifersuchtwitz constitutes a proper Saussurian coupling. It realizes, at the level of a phrase and its antiphrase, what Saussure said of every vowel in its page 230. Page 231. Countervowel in a line. Here the rule operates at the level of an entire syntagma, whereas in Saussure it operates only on non-signifying elements, phonemes or diphonies, but the spark of pleasure, the wits, or the poem, always derives from the same rule of the signifier's revolution around itself. Meaning, the wealth of meaning or of multiple meanings does not matter. Quite the opposite, the signified often makes the pleasure of the wits relatively slight, and signifieds come to end the game to safeguard meaning. Whereas, in the infinitesimal lapse of time as the signifier turns back on itself, in the time of this cancellation, there is an infinity of meaning, a virtuality of infinite substitution, a crazy and ultra-fast expenditure, an instantaneous short circuit of all messages, but always non-signified. Meaning has not taken, it remains in a state of centrifugal circulation, revolution, incessantly given and returned like goods in symbolic exchange. They never fall under the authority of value. Freud often speaks of joke technique, which he distinguishes from the basic process in this way. The joke technique consists in the use of the same name twice, once as a whole and again divided up into separate syllables, in the manner of a riddle. Standard Edition, Volume 8, 1960, p. 31. But this is nothing but technique. The same goes for the multiple use of the same material. All these techniques can be summarized under a single category, that is, condensation. The multiple use of the same material is a special case of condensation. Play upon words is nothing other than a condensation without substitute formation. Condensation remains the wider category. All these techniques are dominated by a tendency to compression, or rather to saving. It all seems to be a question of economy. In Hamlet's words, thrift, Horatio. Ibid, p. 42. What Freud neglects here is that the techniques of the wits are by themselves sources of pleasure. He affirms this, but only, however, in order to add, as quickly as possible. We now see that what we have described as the techniques of jokes are rather the sources from which jokes provide pleasure. The technique which is characteristic of jokes and peculiar to them, however, consists in their procedure for safeguarding the use of these methods for providing pleasure against the objections raised by criticism, which would put an end to the pleasure. Their function consists from the first in lifting internal inhibitions and in making sources of pleasure fertile which have been rendered inaccessible by those inhibitions. Ibid. p. 130. Thus everything that might have arisen from the procedure of the wits itself is referred back to an original source for which the wits is no longer anything other than a technical medium. The same schema applies to the pleasure of recognizing and remembering. This rediscovery of what is familiar is pleasurable, and once more it is not difficult for us to recognize this pleasure as a pleasure in economy and to relate it to economy in psychical expenditure. Recognition is pleasurable in itself. Page 231. Page 232. i.e., through relieving psychical expenditure. Rhymes, alliterations, refrains, and other forms of repeating similar verbal sounds which occur in verse, make use of the same source of pleasure, the rediscovery of something familiar. Ibid. Pages 1212. Again, these techniques, which show so much similarity to that of multiple use in the case of jokes, Ibid. p. 122, have no meaning in themselves. They are subordinated to the resurgence of anemic content, conscious or unconscious. Amongst other things, it may be an originary or childhood phantasm, of which these techniques are only the means of expression. 15. Like the poetic, every interpretation of the wits in terms of the liberation of phantasms or psychical energy is false. When the signified begins to erupt and circulate in every sense, the simultaneity of signifieds from different levels of the psychical apparatus, the transversality of the signifier under the pressure of the primary processes, we do not laugh and we do not enjoy, there is only anguish, hallucination, and madness. Ambiguity and polysemia produce anguish, because the obsession with meaning, the moral law of signification, remains in its entirety, whereas a single, clear meaning no longer responds. Enjoyment, on the contrary, comes from what every imperative, every reference to meaning, manifest or latent, has swept aside, and this is only possible in an exact reversibility of all meaning, not in the proliferation, but in the meticulous reversal of all meaning. The same goes for energy, neither its explosive liberation, its unbinding, its solitary drift, nor its intensity is enjoyment. Reversibility is the only source of enjoyment. 16. When we laugh or enjoy, it is because, in one way or another, a twisting or distortion of the signifier or energy has managed to create a void. Thus the story of someone who loses his key in a dark alley and is looking for it under the street light, because this is the only chance he has of finding it. The lost key can be given every hidden meaning. Mother/death, phallus castration, etc., all undecidable for that matter, but this is unimportant. The void of logical reason is reduplicated exactly in order to be destroyed, and it is in the void thus created that the laugh and enjoyment burst out. Not, however, in order that this void emerges from its subsoil and establishes itself. Lyotard. Freud puts this extremely well, Entfesselung des Unsins, the unleashing of nonsense. But nonsense is not the hidden hell of meaning sense, nor the emulsion of all the repressed and contradictory meanings. It is the meticulous reversibility of every term subversion. Through reversal, it is by means of the internal logic of the wits that one of its external characteristics must be interpreted. It shares itself out, it does not consume itself alone, it is meaningful only in exchange. The flash of wit or the funny story are like symbolic goods, like champagne, presents, rare goods, or women in primitive societies. The wits provokes laughter, or the reciprocity of another funny story, or even a veritable potluck of stories in succession. We know the symbolic network of complicity that binds certain Page 232. Page 233. Stories or jokes, that go from one to the other as poetry used to. Here, everything answers to the symbolic obligation. 2. Keep a funny story to oneself is absurd, not to laugh is offensive, but to laugh first at one's own story also shatters the subtle laws of exchange in its own way. 17. The wits is necessarily inscribed in a symbolic exchange because it is bound to a symbolic, rather than an economic, mode of enjoyment. If this was a matter of psychical saving, we fail to see why everyone does not laugh alone, or is not the first to laugh with all this liberated psychical energy. There must, therefore, have been something other than unconscious economic mechanisms to compel reciprocity. This something else is precisely the symbolic cancellation of value. It is because terms are symbolically exchanged, that is to say become reversible and are cancelled in their own operations, that the poetic and the wits institute a social relation of the same type. Only subjects dispossessed of their identity, like words, are devoted to social reciprocity in laughter and enjoyment. An anti-materialist theory of language. We see the outline, in the psychoanalytic interpretation of the dream, of the wits, of neuroses and, by extension, of poetry, of a materialist theory of language. The work of the primary process is possible because the unconscious treats words as things. The signifier, escaping the horizon and the finality of the signified, becomes pure material once more. Available for another labor, an elementary material available for the foldings, transports and telescopings of the primary process. The phonemic substance of language takes on the immanence of the material thing, lapsing back into, if these formulae have any meaning at all, primary articulation, signifying units, perhaps even into secondary articulation. Distinct units, sounds, or even letters, are then conceived as the atoms of a substance no different from that of the body. It may seem that there was an unsurpassable radically of language here. To treat words as things would be in principle the fundamental operation of language, since it seems that we have the last word when we finally draw out a materialist base. But the same goes for materialism as it does for everything else. The philosophical destiny of this theory is to operate a simple overturning of idealism, without surpassing endless speculation, by simply alternating between the two. Hence the concepts of thing and of matter, negatively forged by idealism as its own hell, its negative phantasm, have passed silently into a positively real phase, indeed into a revolutionary explanatory principle, while losing none of the abstraction that they inherit from their origins. Idealism has created, in repression, the phantasm of a certain matter, which, laden with all the stigmata of idealist repression, re-emerges as materialism. Let's undertake a thorough examination of the concept of the thing by means of which we would like to delimit a beyond of representation. Having evacuated all transcendence, there remains a crude, opaque and objective matter, a substantial entity. Page 233. Page 234. A molar or molecular base of rocks or of language. But do we not see that idealism's last and most subtle resort is to have locked what it denied into this irreducible substantiality, to legitimate it as an adverse referent, as an alibi, and thus to disarm it as an effect of reality which becomes the best support for idealist thought. The thing, substance, infrastructure and matter have never had any other meaning. Even the materialist theory of language falls into the same trap of idealist interdependence. It is not true that words, when they cease to be representations and lose the signs rationale, become things, thus incarnating a more fundamental status of objectivity, a surplus reality, a rediscovered stage of final appeal. There is no worse miscomprehension. To treat words as things, in order to express the thing, the unconscious, in order to materialize a latent energy, Expression always falls into the trap, unless it is the repressed, the unsaid, perhaps the unsayable that here becomes a positive reference, of assuming the force of an authority, an agency, rather than a substance. Western thought cannot bear, and has at bottom never been able to bear, a void of signification, a non-place and a non-value. It requires a topography and an economics. The radical reabsorption of the sign inaugurated in the poetic, and doubtless in the wits as well, has to become the decipherable sign of an unsaid, of something that perhaps will never give up its code, but that thereby merely augments its value. Of course, I understand that psychoanalysis is not a vulgar hermeneutics, it is a more subtle hermeneutics in that something else, another world, another scene is always going on behind the operation of the material signifier, whose twists and turns can always be captured by a specialist discourse. Enjoyment is never purely and simply consumption or consummation. The libido always becomes metabolic in this operation, it always speaks from the depths of phantasm, it always releases affects. In short, linguistic material is already finalized by a positive transformation, here a transcription, it always warrants an interpretation, which envelopes it as its analytic reason. 18. The thing hides itself and hides something else. To look for the force is to look for the signifier. A profound motivation of the sign-symptom, a consubstantiality of word and thing, of the fate of language and the fate of the pulsion, the figure, and the force. A libidinal economy whose principle is always to metaphores, or metonymus, they unconscious, the body, the libido and the phantasm in a linguistic disorder. In linguistic motivation, it is always the arbitrary character of the sign that yields to the positive analogy of the signifier and the thing signified. In psychoanalytic motivation, it is a reverse necessity that binds the deconstructed signifier to a primary energetic potential. Here, motivation appears as the transgression of a form by an insurrectional content. The blind surreality of the libido punctures language's reality principle and its transparency. This is how, in the best cases, the poetic is interpreted. Luciano Berio's organic sound, Artaud's theatre of cruelty, groans, screams and gasps, the incantation and eruption of the body into. Page 234. Page 235. The repressive interiorist space of language. The eruption of the partial pulsions constitutes a partial surface under the seal of repression, simultaneously transgressive and regressive, for this is precisely only the revolution of a repressed content, marked as such by the hegemony of form. This is better than Swinburne's breeze, but it still has to do with motivation and metaphor, a vitalist, energetic, corporealist metaphor of the theatre of cruelty. Therefore, in the final analysis, it is a finalist metaphor, even if it is a matter of a savage finality. The magic of a liberation of an original force, we know Artaud's often shocking affinity with magic and exorcism, and even, in Heliogable, with orgiastic mysticism. Metaphysics is always at the crossroads, as it is at the crossroads of the economic energetic view of the unconscious processes, put simply, that is, the concept of the unconscious, the metaphysical temptation to make the unconscious as substantial as a body, and thus the finality of its liberation. The contemporary illusion of the repression that forms the unconscious as a content, as a force. Form triumphs by circumscribing what it denies as content, and delimiting it within a finality of the expression of content or the resurrection of forces. On this point, there is not so much difference between linguistics and psychoanalysis, since in both there is always the same attempt to base the poetic in the connaturality of the discourse and its object. The distance from words to things is altered by the use made of the thing in the word, by the mediation of its flesh and the echoes its flesh might make, in the caverns of sensibility, of the rumbling created by the thing. J.F. Lyotard, Discours, Figure Paris, Klink-Seek, 1971, p. 77. Thus the linguists try at best to preserve the symbolic value of sound against the thesis of the arbitrary. Further on, Lyotard writes, "The thing is not introduced into language, but its linguistic arrangement spreads it out over words, and between them, the rhythms consonant with those that the thing discussed in the discourse sets up in our body." Ibid, pp. 778. What miracle makes the thing consonant with the word through the medium of the body? Not rhythm, but metaphor. In effect, this is a matter of a positive economy of the metaphor, the idea of a reconciliation between the thing and the word, given back its materiality. But this is false. If it is true that logical discourse denies the materiality of the word corpor, the poetic is not, by means of a simple inversion, the resurrection of the word as thing. Far from making the thing appear, it aims to destroy language itself as a thing. The poetic is precisely the mutual volatilization of the status of thing and discourse. That is to say that it aims at the extermination of language as discourse, but also as materiality. Not by repressing it as discourse does, but by taking it to task to the point of annihilating it. This is how even Kristeva, following Heraclitus and Lucretius, states a materialist theory of the signifier: words do not express the movement of the real, they are it. Not by means of the mediation of ideas, but through. Page 235. Page 236. The consubstantiality, which is more than a correspondence, between the material thing and the phonemic substance of language. Homologous to psychoanalysis, if language makes the unconscious visible, it is not because it expresses it, but because it is of the same structure, and because it is articulated and speaks in the same way. The same cut, the same scene, the same way, and the same work. Where the ancients used to say fire, we say language, the unconscious, the body. But to say that language makes fire, air, water, and earth, or the work of the unconscious, visible because it is itself an element, an elementary substance in direct affinity with all the others, is at once more radical than all the psychonaturalists' motivation, and also very far from the truth. The whole thing needs to be reversed. It is on condition that we see that fire, water, earth, and air are neither values nor positive elements, that they are metaphors of the continual dissolution of value, of the symbolic exchange of the world, on condition that we see that they are not substances but anti-substances, antimatter. This is the sense in which language may be said to reunite them, as soon as it has been torn from the logic of the sign and value. This is what the ancient myths, and the Heraclitan and Nietzschean myth of becoming, used to say about the elements, and it is in this sense that they are poetic, and even superior to every analytic interpretation that transposes this dissolution into the hidden instance of the unsaid, transpiring in a no-saying or a saying other. There is no materialist reference in the symbolic operation, not even an unconscious one, rather there is the operation of an antimatter. We are wary of science fiction, but it is true that there is some analogy between a particle and an antiparticle, whose encounter would result in their mutual annihilation, along with, moreover, a fabulous energy, and the principle of the vowel and its counter-vowel in Saussure, or, in more general terms, between any given signifier and the anagrammatic double that eliminates it. Here again, nothing remains but a fabulous enjoyment. Kristeva writes, in this other space, where logical laws of speech have been weakened, the subject dissolves and, in place of the sign, the clash of signifiers eliminating each other is instituted. An operation of generalized negativity, which has nothing to do with the constitutive negativity of the judgment, Aufhebung, nor with the negativity internal to the judgment, binary logic, 0-1, an annihilating negativity, Sunyavada Buddhism. A zerological subject, a non-subject. Who comes to assume the thought that cancels itself. Poesy et Negativite, p. 212. Beyond the unconscious. The question is this: is there room to offer an hypothesis of the unconscious, this energy and effective potential which, in its repression and in its labor, lies at the basis of the expressive disturbance and dislocation of the order of discourse, and opposes its primary to its secondary processes and hypothesis in terms of the poetic process? Evidently everything hangs together. If the unconscious is this irreversible agency, then the duality of page 236, page 237, the primary and the secondary processes is also irreducible, and the work of meaning can only consist in the return of the repressed, in its transparence in the repressing agency of discourse. In this regard, there is no difference between the poetic and the neurotic, between the poem and the lapsus. We take note of psychoanalysis as radicalism. If the primary processes exist, they are at work everywhere, and are determinant everywhere. Conversely, however, the mere hypothesis of a different order, a symbolic order that provided the economy of the unconscious, prohibition and repression, and which basically resolved the distinction between the primary and the secondary processes, is enough to relativize the whole psychoanalytic perspective, and not only on those marginal territories over which it imperialistically encroaches, anthropology, poetics, politics, etc., but on its own terrain, in the analysis of the psyche, neurosis, and the cure. To turn to Manani again, it cannot be ruled out that psychoanalysis, which originates from the distinction between the primary and the secondary processes, will one day die when this distinction is abolished. The symbolic is already beyond the psychoanalytic unconscious, beyond libidinal economy, just as it is beyond value and political economy. We must see that the symbolic processes, reversibility, anagrammatic dispersal, reabsorption without residue, are not it all mixed up with the primary processes, displacement, condensation, repression. They are mutually opposed, even if together they are opposed to the logical discourse of meaning. This singular difference, also as regards enjoyment, means that a dream, a lapsus, or a joke is not a work of art or a poem. The difference between the symbolic and the libidinal unconscious, today largely effaced by the privilege of psychoanalysis, must be re-established to prohibit psychoanalysis from encroaching where it has nothing to say. Concerning the poetic, the work of art, the symbolic and primitive anthropology, neither Marx nor Freud has been able to say anything unless either has reduced it to the mode of production on the one hand, and to repression and castration on the other. Where psychoanalysis and Marxism come to grief, we must not want to have them fall like angels, or like beasts. They must be pitilessly analyzed according to their failures and omissions. Today, the limits of each are the strategic points of every revolutionary analysis. Marx believed that in economics and its dialectical procedure he rediscovered the fundamental agency. In fact, he discovered, throughout many economic convulsions, what systematically haunted it, the very separation of economics as an agency running through the economic, breeding conflict and making it the site of contradictions is the fantastic autonomization of the economy raised to the level of the reality principle, which these contradictions, however violent, rationalize in their own way. But this is also true of psychoanalysis. Here too, in the term of the unconscious and the labor of the unconscious, Freud gained possession of what, in the form of the individual psychical apparatus, resulted from the page 237, page 238. Fracture of the symbolic as a fundamental agency. The conflictual relation of the conscious to the unconscious relentlessly translates the haunting of this very separation of the psychical as such. Freudian topography, unconscious, preconscious, conscious, merely formalizes, and theorizes as an original given, what results from a destructuration. This analysis of Marx and Freud is critical. But neither are critical in relation to the respective separation of their domains. They are not conscious of the rupture that founds them. They are critical symptomatologies that subtly turn their respective symptomatological fields into the determining field. Primary processes, modes of production, radical words, irreducible schemata of determination. It is as such that they imperialistically export their concepts. Today, Marxism and psychoanalysis try to mix and exchange their concepts. Logically, in fact, if both fell within the province of radical critique, they ought to be able to do this. This is not the case, as the failure of the Freudo-Marxian phantasm in all its forms testifies. But the basic reason for the incessant failure of this conceptual transfer, and why both remain desperate metaphors, is precisely due to the fact that Marxism and psychoanalysis retain their coherence only within their partial definitions, in their ignorance, and cannot therefore be generalized as analytic schemata. A radical theory can be based neither on their synthesis nor on their contamination, but only on their respective extermination. Marxism and psychoanalysis are in crisis. Rather than supporting one another, their respective crises must be telescoped and speeded up. They may yet do each other great collateral damage. We must not be deprived of this spectacle. They are only critical fields. Notes. 1. But forgotten and covered over by all linguistics with especial care, it was only at this cost that it could be established as a science and ensure its structural monopoly in all directions. 2. For what follows concerning the anagrammatic material we refer to Jean Starobinsky, Les mots sous les mots Paris. Gallimard, 1971. For the basic rules, see Le souci de la répétition, pages 1–ff. 3. The term anathema, which can just as easily be an immolated victim as it can a consecrated object, having drifted in the direction of an accursed object or person, should retain all its importance for the rest of this analysis. 4. The same goes for our perception of space and time, which are unthinkable for us in any other way than infinity, a proliferation that corresponds both to their objectification as value and, here too, to the phantasm of an inexhaustible extension or succession. 5. There is a critique to be made here of what Levi Strauss, in his Structural Anthropology 2 vols, Tr.M. Leighton Harmonsworth, Penguin, 19779, calls symbolic efficacity, since for him it remains bound, as is the vulgar representation of magic, to the operation of a myth on the body, or on nature, by means of a symbolic exchange or correspondence of signifieds. For example, the difficult birth, mythic speech remobilises the blocked body along its signified, its content. Instead, the efficacity of the sign must be understood as the resolution of a formula. It is by making the elements of a formula. Page 238. Page 239. Exchange and resolve themselves within this exchange that you induce the same resolution in the sick person's body. The elements of the body, or of nature, enter once again into exchanges with each other. The impact of signs on the body, or on nature, as in the legend of Orpheus, their operating force, derives precisely from not being value. There is no rationalization of the sign in primitive societies, that is to say, there is no separation between its actual operation and a referential signified, no reservoir of meaning where analogies would be conveyed. The symbolic operation is not analogical, it resolves, it is revolutionary, and it concerns the materiality of the sign, which it exterminates as value. There being no more value, the sign actualizes the ambivalence, therefore the total exchange and total reversibility of meaning. Hence its efficacity, since conflicts, including disease, are only ever resolved in the exchange. Actualizing ambivalence, the primitive sign, the affective sign, has no unconscious. It is clear, and equal to its manifest operation. It does not operate indirectly, or by analogy, on the repressed or unconscious representation. Levi Strauss very clearly leans in this direction, in his comparison with psychoanalysis, the sorcerer and his magic, as indeed does all psychoanalytic anthropology. It is its own operation, with no residue, and this is how it operates on the world, this is why it is the direct operation of the world. 6. There again the residue of the analysis fuels the field of knowledge, the constructive eros of science, in exactly the same way as the residues of the poetic become enmeshed in the field of communication. Science and discourse speculate on this residue in their imaginary, where they produce their surplus value and establish their power. What is not analyzed and radically resolved in the symbolic operation is what is frozen under the death mask of value, the beginning of the culture of death and accumulation. 7. But the disappearance of every coherent signified is not sufficient to produce the poetic. If this were the case, then a lexical madness would be sufficient, or an aleatory automatic writing. It is also necessary that the signifier is eliminated. In a rigorous, entirely non-aleatory operation, without which it remains residual, and its mere absurdity will not save it. In automatic writing, for example, the signified is indeed eliminated, it means nothing cane vot reen dire, even though it lives entirely on the nostalgia for the signified, and its pleasure consists in leaving every possible signified to chance. In any case, the signifier is produced here without any control, unresolved, instantaneous waste. The third rule of customary discourse, see above, that of the signifier's absolute availability, has been neither shattered nor overcome. But the poetic mode involves both the liquidation of the signified, and the anagrammatic resolution of the signifier. 8. The humor in this story is so successful because, if there is one thing on which the inscription of death has not taken, where the death drive is barred, it is cybernetic systems. 9. The same goes, in a certain way, for Freud's hypothesis of the death drive. Its process and its content remain, in accordance with his avowed wishes, ultimately unverifiable on the clinical level, but its form, as the principle of mental functioning and the anti-logos, is revolutionary. 10. This is the illusion of being able to separate the two articulations, and eventually extract the one from the other. It is the illusion of being able to rediscover, by splitting the primary, significative articulation, the equivalent of non-linguistic signs in language, gestures, sounds, colors. This illusion leads J.F. Lyotard, in Discours, Figure Paris. Klink-Seek, 1971, to grant the level of the visual or the cry an absolute privilege as spontaneous transgression, always already beyond the discursive and closer to the figural. This illusion remains trapped by the very concept of double articulation, whereby the linguistic order again finds a means to establish itself in the interpretation of what escapes it. 11. Careful here, this all holds for psychoanalysis itself, which also thrives on the rupture between primary and secondary processes, and will die at the end of this separation. And it is true that psychoanalysis is revolutionary and scientific when it explores the page 239, page 240, entire field of channels from the standpoint of this rupture, in the unconscious. But perhaps we will one day see that real, total, and immediate practice does not obey this postulate, or that analytic simulation model, that symbolic practice is from the very first beyond the distinction between primary and secondary processes. To this day, the unconscious and the subject of the unconscious, psychoanalysis and the subject of psychoanalytic knowledge, has lived. The analytic field will have disappeared as such into the separation that it instituted itself for the benefit of the symbolic field. We can already see many signs that this has already taken place. 12. This speech has nothing to do with linguistic sense of the word parole, since the latter is trapped with the long parole opposition and is subject to the long undivided, symbolic, speech itself denies the long parole distinction, just as undivided social practice denies the theory practice distinction. Only linguistic parole says only what it says. But such speech has never existed, unless in the dialogue of the dead. Concrete, actual speech says what it says, along with everything else at the same time. It does not observe the law of the discrete sign and the separation of agencies, it speaks at every level at the same time, or better, it undoes the level of the long, and thus linguistics itself. The latter, by contrast, seeks to impose a parole which would be nothing but the execution of the long, that is to say, the discourse of power. 13 cf. Charles Malamud, Sur la notion de reste dans le Brahmanisme, Wiener Zeitschrift für die Kunst des Sehens, Vol. 16, 1972. 14 In jokes and their relation to the unconscious, Freud cites Kant in the following manner: the comic is an expectation that has turned to nothing. Standard Edition, ed. and Tr. James Strachey, London, Hogarth Press and the Institute of Psychoanalysis, Volume 8, 1960, p. 199, which he takes from Kant's Critique of Judgment, Tr. Werner Pleuer. Indianapolis, in, Hackett, 1987, p. 204, from which I have taken the quotation Tr. 15. It is on the reduction to and the primacy of the economy of the unconscious that the impossibility of ever really theorizing the difference between the phantasm and the work of art rests for Freud. He was able to say that the poets had the intuition of everything he analyzed before him, or even, in Gradova, that psychiatry has no privilege over the poet and that the latter can very well express, without taking anything away from beauty and its works, an unconscious problem in all its profundity. The poetic act remains supplementary, sublime but supplementary. J.F. Lyotard attempts to take Freud up on this point, granting all importance to his distinction between the phantasm and the work of art, while seeking to articulate them rigorously. He first denounces every interpretation in terms of the liberation of the phantasm. To liberate the phantasm is absurd, since the latter is a prohibition of desire, and is of the order of repetition. This is in fact what is currently being produced with the liberation of the unconscious. They liberate it in so far as it is repressed and forbidden, a liberation, that is to say, under the sign of value, of an inverted surplus value. But perhaps this is the revolution. Lyotard writes, the artist struggles to free from the phantasm, from the matrix of figures whose air and whose locus he is, what really belongs to primary process, and is not a repetition. Notes on the critical function of the work of art, in Driftworks New York, Semiotext, E. 1984, p. 74. Translation modified Tr. 4. Freud, art must be situated by reference to the phantasm. Only the artist does not hide his phantasms, he gives them the form of effectively real objects, and furthermore, the presentation he makes of them is a source of aesthetic pleasure. Derive à partir de Marx et Freud Paris, UGE, 1973, p. 56. In Lyotard, this theory takes on inverted ways. The artist's phantasm is not produced in reality as the play, the reconciliation, or the fulfillment of desire, it is produced in reality as a counter-reality. It intervenes only in the lack of reality, hollowing out this lack. The function of art is not to offer a real simulacrum of the fulfillment of desire, it is to show, by way of the play of its figures, what deconstruction of the linguistic and perceptual order must be engaged. Page 240. Page 241. In order that a figure of the unconscious order allows itself to be discerned through its very evasiveness. Presentation of the primary process, Ibid, pages 578. Being the prohibition of desire, however, how can the phantasm suddenly play this subversive role? The same goes for the primary processes. The work of art differs from the dream and the symptom in that in it, the same operations of condensation, displacement, and figuration that, in the dream and the symptom, have the goal of disguising desire. Because it is intolerable, are, in expression, used to push back the bone form of secondary process and exhibit the unform, the unconscious disorder, ibid. p. 58. How are we to understand that the primary processes can be reversed in this way? Are they not themselves bound to repressed desire, or are they then the mode of existence of a per et der unconscious, an unsurpassable, infrastructural unconscious? So Lyotard, who correctly says that one cannot write on the side of the primary processes. Taking the side of the primary process is still an effect of the secondary processes, would condemn himself. But this is exactly what the artist does. The artist's labor may be assimilated to that of the dream and to the operations of the primary process in general, but the artist repeats them and, in so doing, reverses them, because he applies them to the work of this process itself, that is to say, to the figures that arise from the phantasm, ibid. p. 65. And, more radically still, the artist is someone who, in the desire to see death, even at the price of his own death, lends it the upper hand over the desire to produce. Disease is not the eruption of the unconscious, it is this eruption, and the furious struggle against it. The genius advances as far as the same figure of depth as the sick, but rather than defending himself against it, he desires it, ibid. p. 601. But where does this acquiescence to the cruelty of the unconscious come from, if not a reversal of the will from an elusive actual grace? And where does the enjoyment that emanates from this act come from, which must somehow, of course, stem from the form, and not from the content? Form, for Lyotard, is not far removed from the mystic's void. The artist will contrive a deconstructed space. A void, a structure receptive to phantasmatic eruption. Meaning comes about through the violation of discourse, it is a force or a gesture in the field of significations, it remains silent. And in this hole the repressed word merges from its subsoil and establishes itself. This void, this silence, the calming before the eruption, constitutes a dangerous analogy with mystical processes. But where, above all, do they proceed from? What is the process of deconstruction? We soon see that it has nothing to do with the primary process on which we here impose an incomprehensible double role, it is both sides of the reversal. Would we not do better here, frankly, to leave repression and repetition to one side, and to clear the poetic act of all psychoanalytic counterdependence? 16. Pleasure, satisfaction, and the fulfillment of desire belong to the economic order, enjoyment belongs to the symbolic order. We must make a radical distinction between the two. No doubt saving, recognition, psychical ellipsis and compulsive repetition are sources of a certain, somehow entropic, involutive, pleasure, simultaneously heimlich and unheimlich, familiar and disturbing, an endless source of anguish, since it is bound to the repetition of the phantasm. The economic is always accumulative and repetitive. The symbolic is the reversal, the resolution of accumulation and repetition, the resolution of the phantasm. 17. Freud thinks, remaining within the logic of economic interpretation, that if one is not the first to laugh, it is because the initiative for the wits requires a certain psychical expenditure, and is therefore, moreover, unavailable for pleasure. He himself admits that this is not very satisfactory. 18. All matter is raw material. That is to say, that its concept only appears dependent on the appearance of the order of production. All those who would like to be materialists, scientific, semiotic, historical, dialectical, etc., ought to remember this. Even the sensationalist materialism of the 18th century is the first step towards a liberation. Page 241. Page 242. Of the body in accordance with the pleasure function, as raw material in the production of pleasure. Matter is only ever a force of production. But production itself is hardly materialist at all, nor, moreover, is it idealist. It is an order and a code, and that's all there is to it. The same goes for science, it is an order and a code, no more or less materialist than magic or anything else. Page 242. Page 243. Thank you for listening to Symbolic Exchange and Death Theory, Culture and Society. By Jean Baudrillard. Producing audiobooks is a very demanding task, even if they are read by a robot.